Good evening. Tonight we step into one of the darkest chapters of the past, a time when survival meant more than simply avoiding death. It meant living through the aftermath of it. This is the story of those who endured the Black Death, not just during its cruel sweep, but in the silence that followed. The year is 1350. The plague has passed, but what's left behind is emptier, heavier, and somehow even more haunting. This isn't a tale of knights or castles, but of quiet mornings in abandoned villages, of meals eaten alone, of laughter that never returned. And yet, within that silence, there was also resilience, the quiet courage of rebuilding when there was no map forward. If you enjoy these calm journeys through the shadows of history, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you? I love seeing how we all gather here quietly across time zones. Now settle in. Let's begin. The world didn't end with the plague. It just forgot how to speak. The clatter of carts, the hum of gossip from windows, the clanging rhythm of iron on anvils. All of it gone. In its place, silence settled thick across the village like a second plague, one that crept into bone and breath. You'd step outside your hut each morning and hear only the wind brushing over scorched rooftops and brittle leaves. Even the birds kept their distance now. The lanes once carved by dozens of feet were overgrown, the once familiar footpaths erased by disuse and neglect. You walked past homes where children once played in the dust, and all that remained were doorways left ajar, curtains unmoving, beds still made for people who never returned. The village wasn't destroyed, it had simply unraveled. The plague took lives, yes, but it also took the rhythm of daily life, the heartbeat of community, and the certainty that tomorrow would look anything like today. You were one of the lucky ones, if survival could be called luck. The fever had swept through your home like wildfire, sparing you, but not your sister. Your father had tried to care for her until he too began to cough. Your mother stopped speaking soon after the second death, and by the time her own body gave out, she had already become a shadow. You remembered it not as a storm, but as a long, steady crumbling, people wasting away, crying in confusion, wailing prayers into dark corners that no longer felt sacred. You buried them with your own hands. The ground was too hard from drought, and you had no priest to guide the rite. You marked their graves with stones and nothing else. When you were finished, you lay down and waited, but death passed you by. And now, here you are, alive and alone. There's no instruction for what to do after the plague, no procession of neighbors to offer support, no council to call a meeting. The baker died. The miller too. You're not sure what happened to the midwife, but no one has seen her in weeks. The well still gives water, but you hesitate each time you pull the rope, wondering what floated there before you arrived. Hunger is a slow beast. It doesn't claw or scream. It just wears you down, quiet and unyielding. You've learned to scrape bark from trees, to boil wild roots and mash them into paste. You've lost weight. Your limbs feel hollow. Every day you open your eyes and don't know what you're hoping to find. The past is unreachable. The future, a fog. And the present? It's the echo of a world that once was, faint, cold, and crumbling. It's strange how the mind adjusts when there's no one left to share its weight. In the beginning, you thought the worst part would be the dying itself, the fevers, the sores, the helplessness. But you were wrong. It's the living afterward that truly wears you down. The days are too long, and the nights are too quiet. Sleep doesn't come easy anymore, not when you know what silence can hide. Every creak of wood, every flutter of wind against the shutters makes you flinch. You keep expecting to hear someone's voice, to turn a corner and find a familiar face. But they're all gone. What remains are the ghosts of routine, the habits that once revolved around others. You still catch yourself setting two bowls for breakfast, even though there's no one to sit across from you. You still glance toward the door at dusk, waiting for your father's return from the fields, even though he's buried beneath them now. Memory, it turns out, is not a comfort. It's a mirror that reflects what you've lost again and again until you begin to fear remembering at all. The body doesn't care about memory, though. It demands food, water, movement. So you rise each day and go through the motions. You tend what's left of the garden, though the soil is dry and the plants brittle. You check the hen house, even though the hens stopped laying weeks ago. You walk the perimeter of the village not because there's danger, but because walking gives your muscles something to do. Sometimes you speak out loud, just a word or two, your own name maybe, just to prove your voice still works. There's no one to hear it. The animals have fled. Even the flies seem less numerous now. You used to curse their swarming, but now you'd welcome the company. You've begun to feel like an afterthought in your own life, a leftover part in a play whose cast has all exited. There's a strangeness to living in a place built for people who are no longer here. Every object you touch was once someone's. A spoon, a pair of shoes, a piece of cloth left hanging from a nail. Even the dust seems to remember. Sometimes you wonder if there are others, people like you, alive but stranded. You think about setting off, walking to the next village or town. But what if there's nothing there? Or worse, what if there is, and you don't belong anymore? Fear and hope live side by side now, feeding off each other like twin wolves. You hope for life, but you fear what life might look like without the ones you loved. So you stay. Each morning you rise, you breathe, you wait. Not for anything in particular, but because waiting gives shape to the emptiness. And in this new world, even emptiness needs structure, or else it will swallow you whole. Before the plague, the sound of footsteps in the lane outside was comforting. It meant the world was awake, that someone was fetching water or heading to the fields. Now when you hear footsteps, your breath catches in your throat. Sometimes it's just your imagination. Other times it's real, but it's not a neighbor or a traveler. It's someone unfamiliar, moving too slowly, too deliberately. You watch from behind shuttered windows, heart pounding, uncertain whether to call out or stay silent. You've heard stories of those who roam now. Not thieves exactly, not yet, but people stripped of civility by hunger and fear. Survivors like you, except more desperate. Some knock on doors and ask for food. Others don't knock at all. You've seen what becomes of kindness when there's nothing left to give. You want to believe people are still good, but the world is different now, and trust is a luxury most can't afford. You've started keeping a blade by your bed, though you're not sure you could ever use it. Still, it's the only kind of comfort left, the feeling that, if it came to it, you wouldn't go down without trying. You're not proud of the suspicion that's taken root in you. Before, everyone knew everyone. You'd share salt with the woman next door, lend your ox to the farmer up the road. If someone's child fell sick, the village gathered to help. Now, if you see someone approach, your first thought is, will they take what little I have? The plague did more than kill. It unstitched the fabric of trust. Doors are bolted, eyes avert. If you do pass another traveler on the road, words are few and hands never shake. You wonder how long this will last. If the children born into this silence will ever know what it means to feel safe around strangers. The longer it goes on, the more normal it starts to feel. Isolation becomes routine. The stillness no longer rings so loudly in your ears, but you notice how small your world has become. Your daily path is a triangle: the well, the garden, the edge of the woods. You used to walk for hours just to visit a cousin in the next hamlet. Now, the thought of going that far makes your stomach tighten. At night, you lie awake listening, not just for danger, but for life. A voice calling out, a song drifting on the wind, anything to remind you that you're not alone in this broken world. Once you heard laughter in the distance, thin, unfamiliar. It could have been madness or maybe a flicker of joy. You didn't go looking. You wanted to, but you didn't. The plague taught you not to chase ghosts. So instead you curled tighter beneath your blanket, knife at your side, and whispered promises to no one. Promises that tomorrow you'd speak, that you'd risk something human again. But morning always comes too fast, and courage seems like a thing that lives only in dreams. The hardest part wasn't the dying, it was what came after. You remember the moment when you first realized you were the only one left in your home. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was loud, like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. The air felt thick, and every creak of the wooden beams above seemed to accuse you. Why you? Why not them? You hadn't eaten in 2 days, but the hunger was easier to bear than the grief. The table still held a bowl of half-eaten stew, its surface dried and cracked like old leather. You hadn't touched it. It belonged to someone else. To the boy who used to laugh through his mouthfuls and annoy his mother by chewing too loudly. You told yourself you'd clean it later. You never did. Cleaning it would mean accepting that no one would return to finish it. So the bowl stayed, and the air in the house grew stale with things unfinished. Meals, arguments, lullabies. Each corner of your home seemed to hold a breath that never fully exhaled. Outside, the world had lost its shape. Gardens once carefully tended now looked like wild, tangled dreams. Fences leaned in on themselves. Doors hung crooked, never shut quite right. Nature had crept in quickly, as if eager to reclaim what people had stolen from it. You watched ivy crawl up a neighbor's wall like fingers searching for a pulse. Birds nested in the rafters of an abandoned barn. You started to wonder if the world had ever really belonged to you at all. Maybe people were just a brief interruption, an odd footnote in the story of trees and rivers. It's a strange thought, but not a frightening one. At least not anymore. Fear was the first thing to go. After enough loss, you stopped expecting safety. What replaced it wasn't courage exactly, just a kind of stillness. You moved more slowly now. You spoke less. You learned to be small, to take up less space in a world that felt too big without the others. You began talking to the dead, not out loud at first, just in your head. You imagined what your mother might say if she saw the weeds creeping across the threshold. You told your sister about the strange red mushroom growing where her shoes used to sit. You apologized to your father for breaking the stool he built, even though it was already cracked. These were not the ramblings of madness. They were survival. Words needed somewhere to go, even if they landed in empty rooms. Grief needs witnesses, and if the only ones left are the dead, then so be it. You built them altars of memory, a ribbon left tied to a window latch, a stone arranged just so beside the door. Rituals with no audience but your own aching heart. Because surviving didn't mean moving on. It meant carrying the silence and learning how to speak inside it. The hunger was clever. It didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, in small, forgettable ways. First, it was the thinning porridge. Then, the missing eggs. Eventually, it was the skipped meals that felt like choices until they weren't. At first, you searched for food with purpose, believing you could outsmart scarcity. You scoured the abandoned cottages, hoping someone had left behind a jar of dried peas or a sack of barley. But every cupboard was bare, every root cellar emptied or already looted. You considered traveling to the next village, but what if it too had gone silent? What if you walked days only to find the same hollow homes, the same gnawed bones by the hearth, the same unburied dead? So you stayed. You learned which weeds didn't make you sick. You boiled acorns and peeled the bitterness from their skins. You picked mushrooms with shaking hands, praying each time that you remembered which ones killed. You did not feast. You gnawed, you sucked marrow, you scavenged. You told yourself that the pain was temporary, that the next season might bring better fortune. But you knew better. Seasons weren't promises anymore. They were guesses in the dark. The livestock that once fed the village had long since vanished, stolen, starved, or simply fled. The hens were the first to disappear, taken in the night by foxes or men too hungry to knock. The pigs followed, then the goats. You remember watching your neighbor's cow wander into the woods, ribs showing, no one to chase after her. She didn't return. You began to see animals not as companions or tools, but as lifelines. One day, a thin dog appeared near your door, tail low, eyes hollow. It looked at you, and you looked back, both of you starving. You didn't kill it. You shared your last scrap of meat instead. You told yourself it was because you needed a friend, but deep down, you knew you were hoping the dog would remember and return the favor if it came to that. The hardest moments came at dusk. That was when the body ached most, and the light failed, and the belly cried out in ways you couldn't ignore. You'd lie awake listening to your own stomach echo inside you, a sound both ancient and childlike. You began to dream of food in vivid detail, of honey on bread, of steaming stews, of fruit so ripe it burst between your teeth. You'd wake with your mouth watering, ashamed. Sometimes you cried, quietly, so the walls wouldn't hear. And sometimes you didn't. You just lay still, eyes open, letting the feeling pass like a storm. Because what else could you do? There was no rescue coming, no relief caravan, no merchant returning with sacks of grain. The world had thinned out, and you with it. Every day you endured was a day stolen from the grave. But survival, you were learning, wasn't triumph. It was ache. It was waiting. And it was wondering how long the body could endure before the mind gave up. When the fields began to change, it was subtle at first. The neat rows your father once furrowed with care had long since lost their shape, but now the earth itself seemed to shift. Wheat stalks, never harvested, bowed under their own weight before rotting where they stood. Patches of thistle and thorn spread across what used to be tidy garden beds. Even the scarecrows, once amusing with their floppy hats and crooked grins, now stood like mute witnesses to your failure. You tried to keep it going in the early weeks, clearing weeds, turning soil, planting seed by memory rather than instruction, but it didn't take. The rain came too hard, or not at all. The insects devoured what little sprouted. No one ever taught you how to tend a field alone. Farming had always been communal. A neighbor lent a hoe, a cousin brought extra seed, an elder advised when to plant by the slant of the sun. Now you looked to the sky and saw only questions, no signs, no answers, just clouds that passed over without care, and birds that circled not as omens, but as scavengers. It became clear that land left alone forgets how to feed. Nature doesn't forgive absence, it reclaims. Vines split the walls of the storage barn. Roots clawed beneath the foundations of your neighbor's home. The boundary between house and forest blurred. The wild returned, not as enemy, but as consequence. You walked the fields in the mornings to check on what remained, but most days you returned with nothing more than muddy feet and a heavier heart. The work of 5 people could not be done by one. The balance that once held the village upright had been broken, not just by death, but by the slow, inevitable collapse of systems no one had thought to write down. You remembered watching your uncle mend the cartwheel. You remembered how your aunt dried herbs in a rack above the fire. They had done these things so often, so effortlessly, that you never thought to ask how. Now their knowledge was as buried as their bones. The failure of the harvest wasn't just about food, it was about the erosion of purpose. The rhythms that once defined your days, plow, sow, reap, rest, had unraveled into a shapeless stretch of survival. You couldn't even track time anymore. The days blurred together in heat, then cold, then rain. You marked the passing of weeks by the decay of things, a house that collapsed from rot, a field overtaken by nettles, a well that dried to mud. Sometimes you found yourself envying the dead, not out of self-pity, but because they were done. Their struggle was over. They didn't have to watch everything unravel grain by grain, board by board, but you kept going, not out of hope exactly, but because there was nothing else to do. When your hands were in the soil, you didn't have to remember. You didn't have to feel. You just worked, and for a little while that was enough. In the time before, work was something you shared. There was comfort in it, a kind of rhythm to the labor that passed between hands and voices. When the fields needed tending, everyone gathered. When the roof needed patching, the neighbors came with rope and timber. Even hardship, when spread among many, felt somehow lighter. But after the plague, that balance shattered. The weight of survival fell on shoulders that had never carried it alone. Tasks once divided between 5 or 6 now fell entirely to you. The garden, the well, the firewood, the repairs, the bread, all of it. Every morning you awoke not to a single task, but to a dozen, and none could wait. You learned quickly that the world didn't pause for grief. The roof would leak whether or not your heart was broken. The stove would go cold unless you chopped the wood yourself. The hens would starve if you didn't gather feed, even if the sound of their clucking reminded you of your sister laughing in the yard. There were no choices now, only needs, only the next thing and the next. At first, you tried to do it all. You rose before the sun and worked until your legs trembled. You carried buckets with blistered palms. You ground flour from wild grains, coughing on the dust. But your body has limits, and grief made everything heavier. Tasks that once took an hour stretched across the entire day. There was no one to notice when you collapsed in the doorway, no one to say, "That's enough for now." You cried only when the sun had gone, when the dark made you invisible, and the weight inside could spill out freely. But even then, the crying never lasted long. You couldn't afford to waste the strength. There were no luxuries in this new world, not even the luxury of falling apart. You began to cut corners. Let the firewood pile grow low. Let the roof leak in one place, then another. You rationed the flour. You skipped a meal. You wore the same tunic 3 days in a row because washing it meant time and water. And still, it was never enough. You dreamed of another set of hands, not even a voice, just someone to help hold up the corners of this collapsing life. But wishing was wasted energy. So you worked. You worked until your back ached and your eyes blurred. You worked until the sun slipped behind the trees, and then you worked some more. There was a kind of numbness in the repetition, and that numbness was almost a relief. Grief lives in stillness, but work silences it, at least for a while. So you clung to it, even when it broke you down. Because when the world has fallen silent, when the people are gone and the songs have stopped, labor is the only sound left. And for the moment, it's enough to keep you tethered to something real. The mornings were the worst. Waking up meant remembering. For a few fleeting seconds, you would open your eyes and forget the silence. Your ears would reach instinctively for sound, footsteps, the low creak of a door, the murmur of someone stoking the fire. But nothing came. Just wind brushing against the shutter or a distant crow's call, bleak and out of place. The space beside you on the straw mattress was always cold now. No one shifted in their sleep, no soft breath to remind you you weren't alone. The hearth was dark. The coals had died overnight, and the chill in the air didn't just seep into your bones. It reminded you that no one else would be rising to warm the room. You tried to light the fire quickly, but the flint slipped in your fingers. Your hands shook, not from cold, but from something deeper, something hollow. Breakfast, when it came, was never satisfying. You sat where your family used to gather, each space around the table occupied only by memory. You still looked up sometimes, about to speak, to your mother, your brother, anyone, but the words always died before they left your mouth. The silence wasn't quiet. It had weight. It had shape. It pressed against your chest when you sat too still. In the old days, someone was always speaking, arguing, singing, laughing, praying. Even chewing had filled the space with life. Now, you chewed carefully, slowly, as if the sound might offend the ghosts you imagined lingering just outside your vision. You left one of the chairs pulled out, unable to push it in. You told yourself it was for convenience, but it wasn't. It belonged to someone. You didn't know who anymore. It changed depending on the day. Sometimes your father, sometimes a cousin, sometimes a friend whose name you no longer dared say aloud. You couldn't bring yourself to sit in that seat. It felt like stealing from the dead. The house had started to feel too large. It echoed, not with sound, but with absence. Rooms meant for a family were now mausoleums. You avoided certain places entirely. The upper loft where your sister once kept her blanket dolls. The back pantry where your mother stored apples wrapped in straw. The old washing bucket still had her apron draped over the side, stiff now with time and dust. You couldn't move it. Touching it felt like a betrayal. So instead, you stayed in the same two rooms, the kitchen and the front room. You closed off the others, not with boards or locks, but with intention. You let them fall away, as if they'd never existed, as if the people who once lived in them were stories you no longer had the energy to remember. And yet, every night, before you climbed into your bed of straw, you turned your head and looked toward the hallway. Just once. Not out of fear, but because some part of you still hoped that one night someone might be standing there. There was a time when the dead were honored with care. They were washed, dressed, given names and prayers. The whole village would gather, each person adding their voice to the sorrow, their hands to the burial. The passing of a life was a shared burden, softened by ritual. But during the plague, death lost its ceremony. It became mechanical, anonymous, too vast to mourn properly. And now, in its aftermath, there are still too many bones and not enough hands to bury them. You remember where the bodies were left, near the crossroads, outside the old chapel, in wagons that never made it to consecrated ground. There were too many to carry, too few to dig. The ground was cold then, or too dry. The grave diggers had died early. You buried who you could. The rest you covered with cloth or straw, whispering apologies you didn't know how to make. Even now, months later, you sometimes catch the sharp metallic scent of decay on the wind. It doesn't shock you anymore, but it never really fades either. It lingers, like guilt. You pass the unburied often, out on the edge of the village, near the stone wall where travelers once tethered their horses. You avert your gaze, even now, even when all that remains is cloth and bone. They deserve more. But you have no more to give. Your arms are tired. The earth is hard. Your prayers feel hollow. You used to think of these remains as them. Now you sometimes wonder if you'll join them. If one day you'll simply not wake up, and someone else, if anyone is left, will walk past your body, eyes downcast, too burdened to dig. The thought doesn't frighten you as much as it used to. There's no fear in becoming still, only in what's left behind. The graveyards are full, not just with bodies, but with memory. You avoid them when you can, but there are days when you find yourself drawn there, feet moving without thought. You stand among the crooked stones and try to recall the names that went with each. You fail more often than you'd like. Some of the markers are gone, wood rotted, names worn away. One stone simply reads child, and you stare at it longer than you mean to. You realize you no longer cry. Not really. The tears dried up sometime between your brother's last breath and your mother's burial. Grief has turned inward now, calcified into something quieter and heavier. In the stillness of those graveyards, the world feels paused, as if waiting for something to begin again. But you know better. There is no beginning waiting for you, only continuation. The next day, the next chore, the next quiet meal. Still, you pause before leaving. You touch one stone, any stone, as if to say, I haven't forgotten you. Then you walk home, past the empty houses and overgrown paths, holding your silence like a burden, like a promise, like the last prayer you still know how to give. Grief doesn't follow a straight path. It winds and doubles back, changing shape when you least expect it. Some mornings it settles in your chest like a stone, heavy but still. Other times it lashes out, sudden and sharp, over something as small as a shoe left by the door or the faint smell of rosemary in the air. There was a time when sorrow brought people together, when mourning was a communal act. Now, grief is private, solitary. There's no one to witness your pain, no one to place a hand on your back and say they feel it too. The rituals that once guided the heart through loss are broken. You try to piece them together, but they crumble in your hands. You lit a candle once for your brother, watched the flame dance in the darkness until it died. It didn't make you feel better, only lonelier. He would have laughed at the gesture, called it dramatic. And that thought, the sound of his voice in your mind, was what finally broke you. Not the loss itself, but the memory of something ordinary. A laugh, a comment, a presence that will never return. Some days you catch yourself forgetting for just a moment. You might glance toward the door and expect to see someone walk in, or hear a noise in the next room and think it's your sister, until reason sets in like a cold slap. That's the cruelest trick of surviving, the mind's refusal to let go, its desperate attempt to stitch the old world back together with bits of memory. But the seams don't hold. The past is gone. What remains is an ache that has no name, no direction, only persistence. You talk less now. Not because you have nothing to say, but because there's no one left to answer. You've spoken entire conversations in your head, debates, jokes, even arguments with people who no longer exist. It helps, a little, or maybe it doesn't. It's hard to tell. The silence has become a second skin. You wear it every day. You walk through it. You sleep under it. But it chafes, it tightens, it itches in ways you can't scratch. When the wind picks up, carrying leaves and dust through the alleyways of your village, it almost sounds like a voice calling your name. You always turn to look, always. And always there's nothing there, just the world, reshaping itself in the absence of people. You try to mark the days, but they blur. You tried carving lines into the wall, but abandoned it after the 50th mark. What was the point? Time meant something when there were birthdays and feast days and market fairs. Now it's just a procession of sunrises and sunsets with no ceremony. You keep going because stopping feels worse. You plant a few seeds even though you doubt they'll grow. You sweep the doorstep even if no one will visit. You perform these small acts not because they matter, but because they remind you that you're still here, still trying, still mourning. still surviving. The church bell used to ring every morning. Its deep, steady voice echoed through the valley, calling the faithful to prayer, marking time in a world that once felt dependable. It rang for births, for deaths, for weddings. It rang for feast days and fasts, for joy and sorrow alike. And when the plague came, it rang constantly, until it didn't. The last time you heard it toll was for the burial of a priest, and after that, silence. The bell tower still stands, but the ropes are frayed and the gears rusted from disuse. Sometimes, in moments of stillness, you look toward it, half expecting the sound to return. But the silence from that tower is louder than any chime it ever gave. It's a silence that reminds you how empty the sacred has become. The church is still there, of course. The doors swing in the wind, the altar gathers dust. Candles sit half melted, their flames extinguished by time and breathlessness. You walked inside once, thinking it might feel like home. It didn't. The air was cold, heavy, and the echo of your footsteps felt like an intrusion. The priest is gone. You don't know if he died or fled. Either way, no one's come to take his place. The holy books are still open on the lectern, pages curled with moisture, ink bleeding at the edges. You tried to read a passage once, but the words sat flat on the page. You remember them sounding grander before, when they were read aloud by someone who believed them. Now they're just marks on parchment, symbols of promises that feel distant and frayed. You still cross yourself sometimes, out of habit more than faith. You still whisper prayers when the fear creeps in at night. But there's no longer any comfort in them, no response. The heavens have grown quiet. And when you ask why, you receive only more silence. Others speak of the same feeling. When you do encounter survivors, brief meetings on the road or across distant fields, there's a hesitance to mention God. Not because of blasphemy, but because faith itself feels too fragile to touch. What kind of God would allow this? The question hangs in the air, unspoken but present, like smoke after a fire. Some people cling tighter to belief, praying harder, making vows, fasting, hoping that devotion will shield them from whatever curse still lingers. Others turn their backs entirely, casting away their rosaries and refusing to enter the ruins of churches. You don't know where you fall. Most days, you hover between doubt and longing. You want to believe that the suffering meant something, that those who died are at peace, that your own endurance has value. But faith without community feels hollow, like a song sung to an empty room. Still, sometimes you light a candle on the altar, not for answers, just for warmth, just to watch the flame dance for a while, reminding you that not everything is gone. Not yet. There's a particular kind of emptiness that comes from standing inside a church where no one prays. The space feels wider than it did before, as if the walls themselves are trying to distance themselves from the absence within. You step inside, and every footfall echoes too loudly, each one bouncing back like a question. Where are the voices? The incense? The people? Once, this was the heart of the village, its soul braided into every carved beam and stone floor. On Sundays, the pews were packed. Children squirmed beside their parents. Old women whispered their rosaries. You'd smell beeswax and wood smoke and bread still fresh on breath. It had its own sound, the church, soft murmurs, the creak of wood, the low chant of psalms. Now all that's left is the dust, clinging to every surface, settling in the folds of linen still hanging from the altar. The silence inside isn't peaceful, it's accusatory. You kneel at the pew out of habit, your knees finding the grooves worn into the wood by 100 other knees before yours. And you realize you're alone in a place that once promised you'd never be. You used to believe the church could hold grief, that within its walls, Sorrow could be softened, given shape by scripture and ritual. But now the grief is too large, too raw. It seeps through the cracks and pools on the floor like spilled water, soaking into the stone. You try to pray, but the words feel wrong in your mouth. Too clean, too light for what you carry. You whisper names instead, one by one, as many as you can remember, each one a thread pulled from the tapestry of your former life. Some of them you can barely speak without breaking. Others you say with a strange detachment, as if speaking about a character in a story you once knew. The names echo off the walls and return to you, smaller, more fragile, as if afraid to stay too long in such a hollow place. No one tends the chapel anymore. The candlesticks are empty. The holy water has gone stale. The icon of the Virgin has a crack across her face, splitting her gaze into something unreadable. And yet, you keep coming back. Not every day, but often enough that your footsteps have started to carve a new path through the dust. You sit. You say nothing. And in that nothing, you sometimes feel the faintest thread of presence. Not God, perhaps. Not exactly, but something. Memory, maybe. The weight of all who once sat here beside you, shoulder to shoulder, bound by belief, or hope, or need. You reach out and touch the back of the pew in front of you, imagining the hand that might have rested there last. You close your eyes, not to pray, but to remember. The church no longer saves. It no longer offers miracles. But for a few moments, in its stillness, it lets you feel like part of something larger than your grief. And sometimes, that's enough. Love, too, changed after the plague. It no longer bloomed slowly or gently. There was no time for bashful glances or stolen kisses by the well. Courtship, if it happened at all, was swift and silent. People married out of necessity, not out of passion. You saw it happen around you. Survivors pairing off quickly, sometimes days after a spouse had been buried. A widow and a blacksmith, a farmer and a girl who hadn't yet stopped weeping. These unions weren't romantic. They were desperate scaffolds, hastily erected to keep lives from collapsing. You don't judge them. How could you? Companionship, protection, help in the fields. These were now the building blocks of survival. You understood, even as the old part of your heart, the part that once dreamed of letters and lantern-lit dances, began to wither. You couldn't afford to believe in storybook endings anymore. You began to understand that intimacy, once something earned and nurtured, had become a commodity traded like bread or blankets. Bodies needed to be kept warm. Homes needed more than one set of hands. And children, whether wanted or not, were sometimes the only future people could imagine. You tried to ignore it, the way people began to treat love like barter. But it was everywhere. You saw it in the way people looked at each other, calculating, wary. A young woman with a thatched roof but no plow was as vulnerable as a man with grain but no wife to bake the bread. The old dances stopped. The festivals vanished. No one flirted anymore. There was no laughter behind hedgerows, no gossip passed between doorways about who might be sweet on whom. Everything had become functional. You once saw a couple exchange vows in front of a priest's grave, the bride still wearing black for her first husband. There were no flowers, no songs, just a muttered prayer and a shaking of hands. They left together afterward, not smiling, not crying, just resigned. You watched them walk away and felt something tighten in your chest. Not sorrow exactly, but the ache of something lost forever. You found yourself wondering what kind of love, if any, could survive this new world. What affection could grow in soil so soaked with grief? If someone had asked you to marry, to join forces, to pool resources, you don't know what you would have said. Perhaps yes, Not because you were ready, but because saying no meant isolation. And isolation, over time, becomes its own kind of death. You thought once that love was about feeling something indescribable. Now you feared it might only be about feeling less alone. You told yourself that was still worth something, but it wasn't the dream you once held close. It wasn't the whispered promises beneath a midsummer moon or the thrill of brushing fingers in a crowded room. It was colder, quieter. Like everything else that had survived the plague, love too had been hollowed out and reshaped. Not gone, but no longer recognizable. The children didn't stay children for long. Those who survived the plague, whether by fortune, resilience, or something more mysterious, emerged from it changed. Not just thinned by hunger or hardened by grief, but aged in ways that no adult could quite explain. You watched them move through the village with eyes too still, too knowing. They no longer played in the fields or chased geese through the alleys. Their laughter, once a constant background to village life, had vanished entirely. You remember one boy, barely 9, who now carried water from the well like a grown man. He didn't complain. He didn't speak unless spoken to. And when he did, it was with a kind of quiet resignation you usually only heard in the voices of men twice his age. The little girls who once played house with straw dolls now stirred thin porridge over dying coals, their hands raw and red from labor. They tucked their younger siblings in at night, and when they whispered lullabies, the melodies cracked with exhaustion. No one called them children anymore. There was no time for that. Orphans became a common sight, wandering alone or clinging to distant relatives who had barely survived themselves. There were no longer enough adults to raise them gently, to guide them with patience and love. Instead, they were folded into the machinery of survival, given tasks too large for their hands and too heavy for their hearts. Some children simply vanished, taken in by other villages perhaps, or lost to the woods, or worse. You didn't ask. It hurt too much to imagine their endings. Others stayed, but not as you remembered them. Their games became grim. You saw them building tiny graves in the dirt, burying bits of cloth and naming them after the dead. They mimicked funerals with eerie precision, singing hymns in voices barely above a whisper. It unsettled you in ways you couldn't explain. Not because they were doing something wrong, but because they were doing it so well. They'd learned to grieve before they'd learned to dream. You sometimes tried to reach out to them, to smile, to offer a kind word or a piece of bread. But kindness, too, had become something they eyed with suspicion. You couldn't blame them. They'd watched the world unravel. They'd heard prayers go unanswered. They'd seen parents die and siblings buried without rites. What comfort could you possibly offer that they hadn't already been forced to deny themselves? One girl, maybe 6 years old, took your hand once, just for a moment. She didn't speak. She only looked at you with wide, sunken eyes, and in them you saw your own reflection. Not as you were, but as you'd become. Hollowed out, surviving, aching in silence. When she let go, her hand was cold, and the warmth she left behind on your skin lingered longer than you expected, like a reminder that even in the wreckage, someone still needed you to keep going. Even if they didn't say it, even if they didn't believe it themselves. The village square used to be the heart of it all. It was where news traveled, where bread was traded, where laughter and quarrels echoed off the stone walls. You remember the sound of it, the clamor of carts, the shouts of vendors, the occasional burst of music from a traveling minstrel. Now it's silent. You walk through it sometimes, out of habit more than purpose, and the emptiness feels wrong, like a song cut off mid-verse. The stalls are empty. The signs that once listed prices hang crooked or have been torn down by wind and time. The fountain in the center, once filled with water drawn up by a clever stonework system, is dry now, choked with leaves and grime. There are no more disputes over whose turn it is to fill a bucket, no more gossip exchanged over wheels of cheese or bolts of cloth. The merchant carts, once so frequent they barely fit in the square, are gone entirely. Some rotted where they stood, their wares scattered or stolen. Others were simply never returned. It's hard to say what happened to the merchants themselves, but you rarely hear of anyone traveling anymore. Roads are dangerous and trade is a memory. You linger near the old apothecary's shop sometimes. Its windows are boarded, the herbs in the window boxes long dead. The woman who owned it was the first to fall ill in your village. She was kind, always gave you extra chamomile when she knew you had trouble sleeping. You think of her often when your dreams turn restless. Next to her shop is the blacksmith's forge, cold now for months. The tools are still there, too heavy to steal, too covered in soot to tempt the desperate. You imagine them rusting slowly, forgotten by time. No one has need for horseshoes or hinges anymore when there are so few animals, so few doors still used. Even the inn, once the liveliest building in town, with its smoky hearth and clattering mugs, is shuttered and sagging, its timbers groaning like they miss the weight of dancing feet and drunken stories. You sometimes sit on the edge of the fountain and look around, trying to summon the ghosts of what once was. You can almost see them, the baker hauling fresh loaves in a wide basket, the children chasing geese, the old man who played the fiddle on market days. They exist only in your memory now, flickering like candlelight in a room that no longer has windows. The square, like you, survives in body, but not in spirit. You wonder what it would take to bring it back. What spark could rekindle the soul of a place hollowed out by loss? But no one comes. No one sings. No one argues over the last apple. It's just you and the wind and the distant creak of something collapsing. And in that silence, you feel the weight of being a witness, of remembering too much, of loving a world that may never return. There's a fine line between a neighbor and a stranger, and after the plague, that line dissolved almost entirely. The faces you once knew so well, faces you grew up with, broke bread with, whispered secrets to under moonlight, became unreadable, distant. You still passed each other from time to time, crossing opposite ends of the village or catching a glimpse through open shutters. But where once there had been smiles and nods, now there was only the tightness of the mouth, the averting of eyes. Everyone had learned to survive alone, and in doing so, something essential had been lost. You felt it most during those brief encounters, the way silence stretched unnaturally between you. Even when someone did speak, the words felt clipped, functional. Need anything? Rain's coming. Saw a wolf near the hill. There was no warmth in it, no lingering. As if human contact had become something to be rationed, like flour or firewood. You couldn't blame anyone. Trust had become dangerous. Even a shared meal could carry risk. And beneath every interaction was a quiet question no one dared voice. Why did you survive when others didn't? There had been moments early on when people still tried to reach out, to form new bonds out of shared grief. You remember a woman leaving a jar of broth at your doorstep without a word. Another man, missing 2 fingers from the fever, once mended your fence. These gestures mattered. They were attempts at stitching together the frayed edges of your community. But they were rare and they didn't last. Too many things went missing. Too many rumors spread. Someone's pantry was broken into. Someone's well was poisoned, or so they claimed. The stories grew wild, and the village turned inward. You learned to keep your door bolted, even in daylight. You buried your food. You marked your tools with paint, just in case. It wasn't hatred, it was fear. Everyone was just trying to hold on to the little they had left. Suspicion became a second language. You'd hear it in the way people asked questions, always a little too cautious, always hedged. You learned to speak it too. When a stranger appeared at the edge of the fields, you didn't wave, you watched. When a child wandered too close to your garden, you didn't call out. You waited for their parent to retrieve them. You hated yourself for it, but you didn't stop. Because kindness could cost you everything now. A moment of generosity, and you might find your home emptied the next day. So you held your warmth in check, guarded it like a candle in the wind. What used to bind you together, festivals, prayers, shared loss, now kept you apart. You were all survivors, yes, but you had become islands, floating in the same sea without ever drawing near. The plague didn't just take lives, it took fellowship. It turned neighbor against neighbor, not with violence, but with quiet, mutual withdrawal. And the loneliness that followed was sharper than hunger, colder than winter, and far harder to name. Long after the dying stopped, the fear remained. It hung in the air like damp mist, seeping into skin, into thoughts, into every corner of daily life. It didn't matter that the coughing had ceased or that the black swellings no longer bloomed beneath the skin. Fear didn't need proof anymore. It had been fed too well. Even now, months later, you flinch when someone sneezes. Your heart races if you feel the slightest chill in your bones. A scratchy throat is enough to send you spiraling into dread. You check your skin compulsively for spots, feeling for the heat of fever behind your eyes. The rational part of you knows the worst is over, at least for now. But reason means little to a body that remembers terror. The plague carved itself into you, not just in memory, but in muscle. You move differently now, more cautious, as though one wrong gesture might awaken it again. You breathe shallowly in crowds. You sleep light, ready to rise at the first cough. It's not paranoia, it's reflex. You're not the only one who feels it. The village has a new rhythm now, and it's marked by distance. People keep to themselves, not just out of grief, but out of lingering dread. Doorways are thresholds of suspicion. Shared meals are rarer than eclipses. Even voices are quieter, as if loud speech might summon the disease back from the shadows. The children mimic this unspoken rule, learning to hush their games, to back away when others come too close. Once, illness was a misfortune. Now, it's a potential curse, a mark that turns neighbors into pariahs. You've seen it happen. Someone falls ill, not with plague, just a fever or a chill, and by nightfall, no one will speak to them. A bundle of food may be left at their door, but no one lingers. No one waits for thanks. They might recover. They might not. Either way, they will do it odd. It's a cruel way to live, you think. To survive the plague, only to be haunted by its ghost. You catch yourself staring at the horizon more often, wondering if the sickness will return. The stories say it still flares in far-off places, that it comes in waves, like a tide with no moon to guide it. You hear of towns where it has come back, not with the same fury, but with enough strength to remind everyone that it's never truly gone. That knowledge keeps you awake some nights, tracing circles into your blanket, listening for signs in the wind. There's always a moment, just before dawn, when the darkness seems thickest, and in that stillness, the fear wraps around you like a second skin. It tells you not yet. You've survived, yes, but don't grow comfortable. Don't exhale too deeply, because survival is not safety. And peace in this new world is always temporary. It took only one forgotten ember to burn down a house. That was the saying, and it echoed louder now than ever. After the plague, danger didn't always come with fever and rot. It came in smaller, quieter forms. A spark from the hearth, a misstep near a loose beam, a spilled bucket that never got cleaned. With so many hands lost, simple safety became a gamble. You'd wake each morning not only thinking of hunger and grief, but of accidents, mundane things that no one ever used to fear because someone was always there to help. But now, when something broke, it stayed broken. When something caught fire, there was no one to pass the water. You remember the morning the Thatchel house caught flame? No one knew how it started. Maybe the child left the iron too close to the thatch. Maybe the wind carried a coal from the cook fire. It didn't matter. The flames spread fast, and the shouts came slower. People hesitated. No one knew whether to run in or stand back. You all watched it burn. In the end, there was nothing left but scorched stone and a pair of boots blackened where they stood. The fire revealed more than just the fragility of timber. It revealed how thin your courage had become. Everyone had changed. Before the plague, you'd run toward a scream, toward the smoke. But now, fear rooted you in place. You were so used to keeping yourself alive that risking anything felt unnatural. Helping meant touching. Touching meant danger. The old instincts that once made you neighbors had turned to ash. That night, you lay awake and asked yourself if you could have done more, if you should have. But guilt, like grief, was a constant now. It didn't lead to action anymore. It just lived in the body, quiet and corrosive. The dangers didn't stop with fire. The roads had crumbled. The bridges, never well built to begin with, began to collapse under rot and rain. A single wrong step on the path could break an ankle, and with no doctor left in the village, even that could be the end. You started carrying a walking stick, not for age, but for caution. You tested every board before crossing it. You walked wide around old wells, and you never left the house after dark, not without a lantern and a blade. Because while the sickness had retreated, other things had crept in. Wolves, yes, but also desperate people, hollow-eyed and silent, the kind who had lost more than their families, the kind who had lost their names. In the old days, danger had a face: illness, war, hunger. But now it was hidden in every corner: a loose nail, a falling rafter, a stranger's knock. You survived the plague, but in doing so, you entered a world where even safety betrayed you, where the very tools that once kept you alive, fire, water, rope, wood, now waited for one mistake. And every day you knew it could be yours. Scarcity wasn't new, but after the plague, it became the law of the land. Everything was limited: bread, salt, fabric, time. There were no guarantees anymore, not even the things you used to take for granted. A sack of flour, once a household staple, became a treasure. Salt was hoarded like gold. People stopped asking for things they needed. They bartered, begged, or stole. You remember the day your last loaf of bread went moldy. It wasn't entirely ruined. You could cut around the green spots, but it still felt like a betrayal. You'd saved it, carefully wrapped it, rationed it out like it was sacred. And still, it turned. You sat on the floor and stared at it for an hour, as if your disappointment could reverse the rot. Eventually, you ate the good part. Of course you did. But it tasted like failure, like all your effort hadn't been enough. Every bite felt stolen, from yourself, from the future, from someone who didn't make it this far. What made it worse was knowing that everything had value now except compassion. Once a kind gesture was worth something. A helping hand meant a meal in return. But now, kindness had no weight unless it came with a physical offering: a piece of cloth, a wedge of cheese, a live hen. Relationships had become transactions. You didn't blame people, you understood. When your pantry was bare and your strength waned, you started seeing the world in terms of cost. Is it worth it to help that man lift his cart if he has nothing to trade? Is it worth the risk to share what little you have with someone who might never repay it? These weren't questions you liked asking, but they came uninvited. again and again, until they echoed inside your skull, even in sleep. The markets never returned in full. A few merchants passed through, but their goods were scarce and their prices cruel. A bolt of cloth cost a season's wages. A jar of honey was treated like wine. You saw people offer family heirlooms, silver spoons, carved beads, even wedding rings, just for food that would barely last a week. And still, others went hungry. You learned not to linger when deals were made. It was easier not to know how much a human life could be bought for now. The wealthy, or what was left of them, barricaded themselves in manor houses, surrounded by food stores and armed guards. They watched the rest of you starve through iron gates. Even nature seemed reluctant to give. The berry bushes bore fewer fruits. The fish stopped biting. You began to wonder if the land itself had grieved too deeply to feed you. Every meal became a quiet ritual, a prayer whispered over hard bread or thin broth. You chewed slowly, knowing it might be the last full bite for days. And in those moments, you didn't feel lucky to have survived. You felt punished, as if life itself had turned against you, not with fire or fever, but with hunger that never left and hope that no longer filled. After the worst of it, when the sickness had finally moved on like a storm leaving wreckage in its wake, the question of leadership loomed like a fresh wound. The old lords, bishops, and stewards who had once held the reins of power were gone, buried in shallow graves or vanished in the chaos. And in their place came silence. No decrees, no protection, no one to enforce law or provide relief. For a brief moment, the absence felt liberating. There were no taxes, no tithes, no orders shouted down from castle windows. But that freedom was quick to sour. Without structure, confusion crept in. Disputes turned violent. Property lines blurred. The man who had once been just a neighbor now claimed to be lord over 3 farms. He had no title, but he had a sword, and no one left to challenge him. You watched power shift, not through noble lineage, but through brute force and boldness. The strongest, the loudest, the most shameless began to rise, not because they were just, but because they were willing to fill the void. And in a world fractured by grief, that was enough. You didn't trust them. How could you? They made promises they had no intention of keeping, protection for loyalty, grain in exchange for labor. But once they had what they wanted, their gaze moved on, and you were left with less than before. The new lords, self-proclaimed and unblessed, held no reverence for tradition. They hoarded supplies, demanded work, and punished those who questioned them. You saw a man whipped in the square for stealing a single apple from an orchard he had planted himself. Another was dragged from his cottage in the night after refusing to surrender his daughter in marriage to one of the new masters. No one intervened. No one spoke up. Silence had become a habit, and yet not all power was seized with cruelty. Some stepped forward with quiet determination. Widows who opened their homes to orphans, monks who returned from the hills to tend the sick, old men who used their memory of the law to settle disputes before they turned bloody. But they were few, and their strength waned quickly under the weight of what remained. Without the resources, the structures, or the authority to enforce their good intentions, they were often swallowed by the tide. You remember one such man, an aging steward, who tried to rebuild the village granary. He worked day and night, offering what little he had to feed the hungry. A week later, he was found dead by the riverbank, robbed, stripped, forgotten. In the absence of true order, you learned to navigate a world run by shadows. You bartered quietly. You kept your head down. You stopped asking who ruled and started asking who could be trusted not to betray you. Power had become a tool of the desperate, not a shield for the weak. And surviving meant learning to step lightly, speak little, and never let anyone know how much you truly had. Because in a world reshaped by loss, the throne was always empty, and someone was always trying to sit in it. You never get used to the smell. It isn't the stench of rot anymore, that sharp, immediate reek that once clung to the air like a curse. No, what lingers now is older, subtler, and somehow worse. It's the smell of dust and decay, of mildew in places no one cleans, of damp stone and spoiled grain. It creeps out of abandoned homes and rises from the floorboards, from beneath floor rushes no one has replaced in months. It clings to clothing no longer washed, to corners where mice nest, to basins never emptied. There is a heaviness to it, like air that has forgotten how to move. You've stopped noticing it moment to moment, but when someone new arrives in the village, their face always flinches at it. It's the scent of stillness, of places left behind, of death that has long since passed but refuses to be forgotten. And once it gets into your nose, into your skin, into the fibers of your blanket, you realize it is everywhere. You carry it with you, even when you leave the house. You've tried to clean. You've opened windows, scrubbed walls, burned sage and lavender where you could find it, but it's never enough. The stench is older than filth. It's woven into the grief of the walls themselves. You wonder if the houses remember their dead, if the wood retains the sounds it once sheltered, crying babies, humming wives, fathers arriving home with muddy boots and stories to tell. Now, nothing moves unless you move it. The air inside each home is stale, as if it's been holding its breath since the last door closed. You avoid certain buildings entirely. The baker's house, where you once lingered for warmth and crusted rolls, now reeks of burnt flour and loneliness. The schoolhouse is worse. The smell there isn't rot, but chalk and faded ink and a bitter trace of oil paint. You caught sight once of a slate still marked with a child's lesson, half erased. You backed out slowly and shut the door without touching anything. Outdoors is better, but not by much. The wells smell sour from disuse. The fields reek of overgrowth and damp furrows left to drown. You stepped in a puddle last week and nearly vomited from the stench. It wasn't water, not really, but something green and sick with time. Even the animals seem changed. The cows that remain smell more of skin than straw. The dogs no longer smell like dogs. They smell like mud and fear. You stopped bringing flowers inside because even their scent faded too fast, replaced again by the air that hangs over everything. Some days you light a fire just to mask it, throwing in pine branches or dry herbs when you can. You don't need the heat, not in summer, but the smoke at least makes you forget for a little while. But when the fire burns out, the smell always returns, thick and patient. It's the scent of survival, and it's never clean. Something shifted in the animals after the plague. You noticed it slowly at first, a missing hen here, a sheep skittish without cause. Then came the bolder signs. Foxes in daylight, eyes gleaming from the tree line. Wolves howling nearer than they should, pacing close to the thatched fences as if testing for weakness. Even the birds grew strange, quiet in the mornings, their songs shorter, uncertain. You began to realize the world had grown quieter not just from death, but because the natural order had come undone. The line between wild and tame, between man's land and beasts, blurred like ink in water. Livestock wandered untended through open gates, their owners long dead. Without dogs to herd or men to guide, the animals grew confused, feral, unpredictable. You saw a once docile ox gore a man who got too close with a rope. Chickens roosted in rafters, no longer laying eggs, as if they too had forgotten their purpose. The animals had adapted faster than you had. They no longer waited on human hands. They no longer trusted them. You began to walk more carefully. You started carrying a stick, then a blade. It wasn't just the wolves. Stray dogs, once companions, now formed hungry packs. You recognized one, your neighbor's mutt, once playful, now lean and watchful. He didn't bark when he saw you. He didn't come close either. He just stared as if weighing whether you were worth the trouble. You used to leave scraps outside, hoping he'd remember. But then a lamb disappeared. Then a neighbor's cat turned up shredded, its body half buried in the garden. You stopped leaving anything out. You barred the doors at dusk, not for people, but for things that moved low and silent in the grass. The night was no longer yours. It belonged to things that could smell your fear through the cracks in the wall. You heard stories, of course, of bears sighted near the mill, of wolves spotted on church steps. One man claimed to have seen a boar asleep in his bed when he returned home from a long journey. No one laughed. Everyone believed him. Because the animals had grown bold, they moved into spaces where people no longer lived. And why shouldn't they? The woods were expanding, roads overgrown, crops untended. The world we had carved out of wilderness was being swallowed again, inch by inch. And no one was stopping it. There were no hunts, no patrols, just tired villagers trying to survive, hoping the predators stayed away one more night. You used to think of animals as tools, as food, as companions. Now you thought of them as rivals, creatures adapting faster to the emptiness than you could. You caught yourself watching them with a strange envy. They didn't mourn. They didn't remember. They simply moved on. Their eyes were clear of grief. Yours were not. And in that difference, you saw the cruelest truth of all. The plague had broken men, but nature hadn't flinched. It just waited for us to fall. And when we did, it moved right back in. There was no music anymore. Not the kind that echoed from lutes beside hearth fires or danced between footsteps on festival days. Not the quick jigs played at weddings or the slow, mournful hymns sung by candlelight. The silence that followed the plague swallowed all of it, as if the air itself forgot how to carry a tune. Laughter had vanished too, not the loud, forced kind that sometimes bubbled up from nerves, but the genuine kind, the deep-bellied sort that once made others join in even if they didn't know the joke. Now, the village was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Even when someone did speak, their voice felt smaller than it should have, like the walls were no longer willing to reflect it back. You missed the sound of voices layered together, shouting across the fields, arguing over apples, singing while hauling buckets from the well. You hadn't realized how much joy existed in those ordinary sounds until they disappeared. And when you did hear something joyful, something melodic, it felt alien, like a memory too far gone to trust. One afternoon, you heard someone humming, a child, hidden behind a collapsed wall, singing to herself as she stacked stones. The melody was cracked, out of tune, and barely audible, but it stopped you in your tracks. You didn't recognize the song, but the sound of it was enough to make your throat tighten. She didn't see you, and when she finished, she didn't smile, didn't look proud. She just went on stacking, as if she hadn't done something miraculous. You didn't say anything. You didn't want to startle the moment away. But you stood there longer than you should have, letting that single thread of sound stitch something fragile back into the air. It didn't last. By evening, the wind had returned, and the silence settled again, like dust on a forgotten shelf. Sometimes, in the quiet of your own home, you tried to recreate the music. Not with instruments, you had none left, but with your voice. A low hum, a chant, a bit of a hymn you half remembered from childhood. The sound startled you. It felt wrong, like using a word you hadn't spoken in years and no longer trusted to mean what it once did. Still, you did it, softly, quietly. You didn't expect it to lift your spirits, and it didn't. But it was something, a pulse in the stillness, proof that you still had breath left to give. You imagined that music might come back one day, that someone would pick up a lute again, that voices would blend once more in song, but it would never be the same. Too many musicians were gone. Too many mouths had closed forever. The songs they knew died with them, and no one had written them down. The silence was not just a pause, it was a loss. A melody forgotten mid-verse, a drum with no hands to beat it. And until the world felt safe enough to sing again, the quiet would remain, heavy, lingering, and loud. Dreams were no longer places of escape. They had become echoes of everything you wished you could forget. Before the plague, you used to dream in color, fields of gold, warm kitchens, the smell of fresh bread on your fingers. Faces glowed in candlelight, laughter laced through the air like ribbons. Now, sleep brought no such comfort. It brought shadows. You dreamed of doors swinging open to empty rooms, of names carved into stone, of voices calling you from behind walls you couldn't break through. Sometimes you relived the worst days, the moments of sickness, the final breath of a loved one, the long walk back from a grave with nothing in your hands. You'd wake tangled in your blanket, chest heaving, unsure for a moment where you were. And then it would come back to you. The stillness, the silence, the world you never asked to survive. And what hurt most wasn't the nightmare, but the truth it left behind, that the dream world and the waking one were now equally hollow. You stopped speaking of your dreams. Everyone did. Not because you didn't remember them, but because you did, too clearly. To describe them aloud felt like dragging ghosts into the room. The old woman who lived 2 cottages down used to mutter in her sleep, and one night you heard her crying out a name. You recognized it as her son's. He'd died in the second wave. She never mentioned it the next day, but you saw the look in her eyes, shaken, distant, like she'd been somewhere no one else could follow. Others confessed to dreams of fires that never burned out, of churches collapsing, of eating and eating but never feeling full. Some dreamed of themselves sick again, watched from above as their own bodies failed. A few dreamed of silence so complete it swallowed their own voices. Even the dreams that should have brought peace, of love, of reunion, of days long gone, were poisoned by waking. You dreamed once of your mother's hands, brushing your hair back as she did when you were young. You woke to find your face wet and your heart heavier than before. For a few terrible seconds, you thought she was nearby. Then came the crashing realization that she was not, that she never would be. And it felt like losing her all over again. You considered trying not to sleep, staying awake longer, busying your hands until the night passed. But the body always won. Exhaustion always returned. And when it did, the dreams followed. Faith did little to protect you there. There were no candles to light in the world behind your eyes, no prayers that softened what waited for you. So you learned to accept it, to close your eyes knowing what might come, to welcome even the worst dreams because at least they meant your mind was still working, still reaching, still trying to stitch meaning from the tattered fabric of memory. But the cost was steep. And in sleep, as in life, peace had become a rare and fleeting thing. When winter came, it didn't feel like a season. It felt like a punishment. Cold has a way of revealing the cracks in everything. In your roof, your boots, your bones, your resolve. Before the plague, winter had always been harsh, but it was manageable. Fires were tended by many hands. Food was preserved and shared. Neighbors huddled together in taverns, telling stories over mugs of ale to pass the long nights. But now, there were no stories, no laughter, no help. Just a biting wind that blew through empty homes and a silence broken only by the cracking of frost on broken shutters. The firewood you had gathered in autumn was barely enough. You rationed it, burned it sparingly, until the hearth gave only smoke and not warmth. You wrapped yourself in layers of wool and linen, some torn from old clothes no one would wear again, and tried not to shiver too loudly in the dark. At night, you curled in on yourself like a wounded animal, listening to the wind howl through holes you didn't have the strength to mend. The hunger grew sharper in the cold. Root cellars had long since emptied. The few vegetables you'd managed to store had shriveled and gone soft with rot. You'd scraped lichen from stones, boiled bark into bitter tea, chewed leather just to keep your mouth moving. You'd learned to pace yourself, not to move too quickly, not to burn too many calories, not to dig too deeply into what little you had left. Winter made you cautious in ways you hadn't been before. You feared not just starvation, but slipping on the ice, falling in the snow, getting sick. A single mistake could end you. There was no one left to help you up if you fell. No doctor to visit, no one to fetch water if you couldn't stand. The animals suffered too. Those that hadn't fled or been eaten now starved beside you. You heard their cries at night, low, desperate sounds that mirrored your own thoughts. One morning, you found a dog curled near your door, frozen in place, its eyes half open and covered in frost. You buried it with shaking hands, not out of sentiment, but because the sight of it hurt too much to bear. You couldn't keep looking at death. Not again. Not even in that small, silent form. You began counting the days, scratching them into the wall beside your bed, not because you expected spring to save you, but because the ritual gave you something to hold on to, a kind of anchor. Winter didn't kill you outright. It simply wore you down, bit by bit. It made everything harder, thinking, moving, believing. And when the thaw finally came, it brought no relief. The snow melted, but it left behind mud, mold, and the smell of things long buried. You stepped outside and felt no joy, only exhaustion. You had survived the cold, yes, but at what cost? The season had passed through you like a blade, slow, silent, and unforgiving. And you knew it would come again. They came out of the forests at dusk, men on foot, sometimes on horses, cloaked in shadow and silence. You never heard them until it was too late. Bandits had always existed in the world beyond the village, but after the plague, they multiplied like rats in the granary. Desperation did that to people. There were fewer walls now, fewer watchmen, fewer consequences. The roads were empty, the inns boarded, the manors left half-guarded. And for those who had nothing to lose, taking from the broken was better than dying with the honest. At first, you heard whispers of raids in nearby villages. Bread stolen, barns burned, a family gone missing. But then it came closer. You saw tracks in the mud behind your house, boot prints too large to belong to anyone you knew. You found your fence pulled down, the latch on your grain store broken. Nothing was taken that time, but the message was clear. Someone had been there. Someone was watching. You started sleeping with your knife in hand, barricading the door with furniture that could be moved. It gave little comfort. Doors were only symbols now. Anyone determined could get through. The worst part wasn't the theft. It was the not knowing who they were. Were they strangers from afar? Or were they once neighbors, changed by hunger and grief? You'd pass familiar faces in the market, if you could call it that now, and wonder. Had they come to your door in the night, cloaked in rags and malice? Had the man who once mended your shoes now taken to stealing goats from yards while their owners slept? Trust had eroded so completely that even a friendly nod felt like a test. You became suspicious of kindness, offers to help you carry water or share salted meat. These were gestures you once cherished. Now they felt like traps, like someone marking your home for later. And so you kept to yourself, moving in daylight, locking everything, even when inside. You buried what little you had left beneath floorboards or in the earth behind your cottage, in places you hoped no one would think to dig. And still, they came. You heard the shouting one night just down the road, a scream, then silence. You didn't open your door. You didn't look out the window. The next morning, the house was blackened by fire, the smell still in the air. No bodies were found, but no one emerged either. You told yourself that staying hidden had been the only choice. But part of you wondered who you might have saved if you just moved, if you just stood up. That guilt curled up next to your fear, and the two became inseparable. The bandits weren't just men, they were a symptom of collapse, of abandonment, of what happens when rules dissolve and the hungry are left to fend with no one watching. They reminded you that survival wasn't just about food or warmth. It was about what you were willing to sacrifice to stay safe. Your trust, your honor, your sleep, your voice. One by one, those pieces slipped away until you barely recognized yourself at all. There was a heaviness to being needed. You might think that surviving the plague would make you invisible, just one ghost among many. But the opposite was true. If you lived and you could still stand, still lift a pail of water, or mend a door hinge, you became necessary. Not celebrated, not admired, just necessary. There was no honor in it, no pride, just a constant grinding weight. You were the one asked to dig the graves because you still had the strength. You were the one called to help with birthings, even though you'd never done it before, because the midwife had died. You were asked to fix the broken wheel, to carry the fevered child, to fetch what someone else had lost. And you couldn't say no. Not really. Not when everyone else who could have helped was already under the soil. At first, it gave you purpose. It distracted you from the grief. But soon enough, it became another burden. Because you weren't strong, you were just the last one standing. And standing alone meant you never got to rest. You stopped sleeping through the night. Not because you were afraid, but because you were waiting. Waiting for someone to knock. Waiting for the next request, the next fire to put out, the next mouth to feed. And they always came. Even strangers. Even people who once wouldn't look at you now stood in your doorway, eyes hollow, asking for help you didn't know how to give. A child crying for medicine. A man asking if you had extra bread. A woman too weak to fetch water. You wanted to help, truly. But with every favor came another crack in the wall you'd built around your own dwindling strength. You gave your herbs away. You split your grain. You stayed out in the cold longer than you should have. You told yourself it was what the dead would have wanted. That if you were going to live through this, you had to mean something. Be useful. Be kind. But slowly you began to disappear inside those acts of service. And worst of all, no one ever asked how you were. The moment you stood and kept standing, the world assumed you could take anything. That because you had survived, you had enough to give. But you didn't. You were tired, not in the way food or fire could fix, but deeper, a soul tiredness that no one saw. You felt it in your bones, in your eyes, in your breath, but you said nothing. You nodded when asked. You carried what was handed to you. You helped again and again. Because who else would? Who else was left? And in the quiet moments when no one was watching, you'd sit on your stool, hands resting in your lap, and feel the ache of all you had given. Not because it wasn't worth it, but because even the strongest hearts still need a place to rest. And in that plague-struck world, there was nowhere left for yours to lay down. You buried them yourself. There was no one else to do it. No priest to say the words, no bell to toll. Just you, the cold earth, and a silence so deep it felt like the whole world had stopped breathing. You didn't know how to dig a grave, not properly. You'd watched others do it before, always in groups, always with help, but now it was your hands and your shovel, if you even had one. Sometimes it was just a broken plank or a flat stone. The ground resisted you, as if it, too, didn't want to accept one more body. You dug anyway, until your hands blistered and your arms shook. You didn't cry, not at first. You were too focused. You had to be. You wrapped the body in whatever you had: blankets, bed sheets, cloaks, sometimes just their clothes. You tried to close their eyes, but they didn't always stay shut. You couldn't bring yourself to cover their face until the last moment. And when you did, it felt like betrayal, as if you were agreeing to forget them. You said their name aloud, not for them, they couldn't hear, but for you. So the earth wouldn't be the last to speak it. You marked the graves with stones. Some were small mounds, some barely more than shallow pits. There were too many to bury deep, and the ground was unforgiving. You tried to keep track of where you placed them, whispering reminders to yourself. He's near the old sycamore, she's by the wall with the ivy. But after a while, the landscape blurred. The weeds grew tall, the wind knocked down the markers, and grief made everything hazy. You stopped counting. Not because you didn't care, but because your memory could no longer bear the weight. Sometimes at night, you dreamed of digging, of endless graves that never filled, of voices calling out from beneath the soil, not angry, just lost. There was no ritual, no procession, just labor. You did your best. You sang old hymns, half remembered and out of tune. You recited prayers that felt hollow but still somehow necessary. You scattered wildflowers when you could find them, or laid a branch across the fresh dirt as a sign that someone had come and cared. It wasn't enough. Nothing was. You wondered what the dead would have thought, being laid to rest by your hands alone. Would they forgive you? Would they have done the same for you? You told yourself yes. You had to believe that. Otherwise, what was the point? In the weeks that followed, you avoided those places. You couldn't walk past them without feeling like you were being watched. Not in a haunted way. Just in that way, the dead make their presence known in everything that remains still. And yet, you kept going. You kept digging when needed. You never said no, because even in a world unraveling, the dead still needed burying. And if you didn't do it, no one would. That was the last kindness left. And you gave it, again and again, with hands that never stopped shaking. There came a day when you simply stopped praying, not out of rage, not even out of disbelief, just silence. You had whispered every sacred word you knew until the syllables lost shape in your mouth. You had begged, bargained, wept through cracked lips at the feet of wooden statues and behind locked chapel doors. And still, the plague came. Still, your family died. Still, the world emptied. So one morning, you lit no candle, made no sign of the cross, and felt no lightning fall upon you. The sun still rose. The crows still circled. The silence was the same. That was what stunned you most, that God said nothing, not in fury, not in comfort. Nothing. The absence of response was heavier than any punishment. You had once believed that suffering had a purpose, that it cleansed, refined, prepared. But the pain that followed the plague was not cleansing. It was dull, endless, without reason. You didn't stop believing, not exactly. you just stopped expecting. The prayers became hollow, the rituals, routine, something you did for the dead, perhaps, but not for yourself. Others felt it too. There was a change in how people approached the sacred, more tentative, more mechanical. You'd watch neighbors genuflect with empty eyes, like actors reciting lines they no longer believed in. Some stopped attending Mass altogether, not from laziness, but from sorrow that hardened into detachment. The priest, if you even still had one, said nothing about it. He performed the rites, blessed the graves, muttered sermons that rarely matched the pain etched in everyone's faces. Maybe he was struggling too. Maybe he too had cried into his robes and waited for an answer that never came. You sometimes imagine the saints stepping back from the world, shielding their eyes from what it had become. Holiness seemed too delicate to survive here, and yet something in you missed the faith, not the words, but the warmth, the feeling that you were held by something beyond yourself. You remembered as a child how church bells made you feel safe, how kneeling beside your mother and whispering prayers gave the day a shape, a rhythm, a reason. Without that, the days unraveled. You still lit candles now and then, not for God, but for memory, for moments, for people. A small flame for your brother's laughter, another for your father's voice, one for the neighbor who used to sing hymns while hanging laundry. These weren't prayers anymore. They were offerings to the past. And maybe, in some way, that was faith too. Not in salvation, not in divine reward, but in memory, in bearing witness, in surviving long enough to say, they were here. And maybe, someday, when the pain is a little duller and the air a little less heavy, you'll find your way back to the altar. Not because you're sure, but because you still long to believe in something. Even if that something is no more than light in the darkness, flickering quietly, asking nothing, promising only warmth. The blacksmith's forge was cold. That alone told you how much the world had changed. Once, it had been the loudest place in the village, iron ringing like church bells, smoke curling into the sky, sparks lighting up the dusk. Now the tools hung quiet on the walls, the coals long dead in the hearth. The blacksmith was gone, buried weeks ago, or maybe months. You couldn't remember anymore. He had been one of the first to fall, and with him went more than a man. He took with him a trade no one else knew. You stared at the anvil once, half tempted to try your hand, but the weight of the hammer alone warned you off. Craftsmanship was not just muscle, it was memory. Skill passed down through generations, suddenly severed. And the blacksmith wasn't the only one. The cobbler's stool sat empty, the weaver's loom untouched, the potter's wheel half covered in dust, frozen mid-turn. Entire livelihoods had disappeared in days, and with them, the invisible web that had once kept the village alive. You didn't notice the loss of skill right away. At first, it was grief that dominated everything. Graves, silence, hunger. But over time, the absence of labor became undeniable. The door hinge that groaned louder with each passing day. The bucket with a fraying rope no one could repair. The cracked shoe that let in water no matter how tightly you wrapped it. Small things at first until they added up to something much larger. A world falling apart in slow motion, not from war or weather, but from the vanishing of hands that knew how to make and mend. And when you tried to step in, to learn by watching, by remembering, the work never came out right. The bread didn't rise. The walls leaned. The clothes itched or tore. Your fingers lacked the memory the elders once held in theirs, and with every mistake, you realized how fragile everything had always been. The markets, such as they were now, had shifted too. Where once there had been rows of cloth, baskets of tools, bolts of rope, now there were only a few desperate traders with scraps, old ware scavenged from abandoned homes, cracked pots, mismatched boots, rusty nails. What had once been common was now precious. A good knife could buy a week's worth of grain. A spool of thread, if it was clean and dry, was bartered like treasure. You no longer asked who made the things you needed. You only asked if they still existed at all. The luxury of origin was gone. It didn't matter if the blade was balanced, if the cloth was dyed well. All that mattered was function. All that mattered was having something instead of nothing. And in this slow erosion of skill, you saw the deeper wound. The plague hadn't just killed people, it had broken the chain between generations. No apprentices, no learning. Just a silence where once there had been teaching, rhythm, craft. A silence that grew with each passing season, and with it, a world that forgot how to hold itself together. Hunger changes people, not just their bodies, but their minds. It whispers to them in ways that nothing else does, and you began to notice it in the eyes of those around you. The way they stared too long at your bread, or how their fingers twitched when your bag shifted too heavily with something hidden inside. It wasn't malice, not at first, just desperation, a shared, silent understanding that what little food remained could be the difference between another day and never waking up again. You saw neighbors who once shared wine and laughter with you begin to hoard roots and dried berries, their kindness replaced with caution. A woman you had known since childhood refused to let you enter her cottage, even when you offered her firewood. "Can't feed both of us," she muttered. And you understood. You didn't blame her. You only hated how natural it had all begun to feel. The suspicion, the measuring of every human interaction in terms of hunger. It was no longer community. It was survival. And survival didn't care about old friendships or generous hearts. You noticed changes in yourself, too. The way you chewed more slowly, not to savor, but to stretch. The way your ears perked at the mention of a missing animal or a hidden garden. You hated yourself for it, for the part of you that listened too closely. But hunger doesn't ask for permission. It carves a space in you and fills it with want. You started hiding food, even from those you trusted. A scrap of cheese under a floorboard. A few withered apples buried in cloth beneath the bed. You told yourself it was precaution, just in case. But really, it was fear. Fear of running out, of being asked to share when you couldn't say no without shame. And when someone did ask, an old man who hadn't eaten in 2 days, you gave him a little, but not all you could. You watched him thank you with trembling hands, and the guilt sat like a stone in your belly. But you didn't offer more. You couldn't, because you were afraid you'd be next. Sometimes, when the hunger grew too sharp, too loud, your thoughts turned dark, not violent, but primal. You began to see the world in terms of sustenance. Could the bark be boiled? Could the nettles be mashed? Could the mice that scurried beneath the floorboards be trapped? You never acted on those thoughts, but they came more often than you cared to admit. Hunger wasn't always screaming. Sometimes it was a quiet tap on your shoulder, a voice whispering, "You're weaker than yesterday. What will you do about it?" You drank more water to fool your stomach. You chewed on leaves just to feel something on your tongue. You dreamed of feasts, roasted meats, sweet fruits, warm bread, and woke with nothing but the ache of longing. The body adjusts. It finds ways to endure. But the mind, starved of comfort and certainty, starts to bend. And you realize then that hunger wasn't just about the stomach. It was about loneliness, about fear, about becoming someone you didn't recognize just to see one more sunrise. The elders were the first to go, and with them went the memory of how things were supposed to be. You hadn't noticed how often you looked to them for answers until there were none left to ask. When to plant, how to treat a fever, what herbs to burn when a storm came. These were things they carried in their heads, passed down through repetition rather than writing. Books were rare, and even when they existed, they told little of the daily wisdom that guided a village through hardship. That knowledge had lived in the hands and voices of the old, the grandmother who knew which weeds could be steeped into tea to settle the stomach, the uncle who remembered where to dig for clay in the riverbed, the carpenter who could read the wood like scripture. You'd always assumed they'd be there, that they'd tell you when the frost was likely, or what dreams meant, what omens. But when the plague came, they vanished like smoke, leaving behind only questions. And now everything you did felt like a guess. Without their guidance, tasks once simple became strange. The bread no longer rose. The soil felt wrong beneath your fingers. You tried to mend a roof and split 3 tiles for every one you laid straight. When a calf was born breech, you had no idea what to do. You whispered for someone to help you, anyone, but only silence answered. And when the animal died, you buried it quickly, ashamed. You weren't angry at the old ones for leaving. You just hadn't realized how much you needed them until you were the one people started asking. A boy came to you with a bloodied finger once, and you fumbled to recall how your mother used to treat cuts. Another asked how to find the North Star, and you pointed wrong. You watched his face fall, not from disappointment, but from something worse, realization, that no one alive truly knew anymore. There were efforts to preserve what scraps of wisdom remained. You saw one woman trying to teach a child to spin wool the way her mother had. Her hands shook and the yarn frayed badly, but she kept going. Another man carved symbols into wood, a crude map of when to sow and when to reap, drawn from memory. But the gaps were everywhere. You felt it in the bones of the village, in buildings patched wrong, in meals cooked without flavor, in rituals performed out of order. A wedding you attended had no one to officiate, so the couple simply held hands and promised each other in front of an empty chapel door. It felt holy, but it also felt sad, like acting out a play whose script had been lost. And now you, young by the old calendar but aged beyond your years, found yourself trying to hold what little remained. Not because you knew what you were doing, but because there was no one else left to pretend they did. And somehow, that pretending became the only way forward. Birth had never been easy, but now it was dangerous in a way that felt almost cruel. With no midwife, no healer, no mother or aunt to offer steady hands and whispered guidance, childbirth became a gamble most dreaded more than death. You had heard it once said that to bring new life into the world was to stand with one foot in the grave. After the plague, both feet were often there. The women labored in silence now, not out of strength, but because there was no one left to cry out to. Their cries echoed in empty cottages, answered only by dust and flickering candlelight. You remember one night being called to help, not because you knew how, but because you were nearby. You had never assisted in birth before. You had never wanted to. But when they knocked at your door, there was no one else. The girl was young, far too young, her belly swollen with something that would not wait. Her eyes were wide with fear. She begged you not to let her die. And all you could do was nod, even though you had no idea how to keep that promise. The birth was long, slow, and wet with sweat and blood. You did what you had seen once, years ago, when the midwife still lived. You boiled cloth. You held her hand. You prayed, though your prayers were more sound than meaning. The room reeked of fear, and the flicker of the fire made shadows dance across the walls like they, too, were bearing witness. When the baby finally came, it did not cry right away. You panicked, rubbing its back, whispering things you didn't understand. When it finally let out a thin wail, you cried too, not with joy, but with sheer relief. The mother lay back, exhausted, too pale, but alive. You wrapped the child and held it close, but the warmth of the moment was brief. You didn't know what came next. Feeding, cleaning, healing. There were no steps, no guidance, just instinct and guesses. You stayed through the night. The baby lived. The mother did too. That time. But not everyone was so lucky. You heard stories or saw them firsthand. Mothers who bled out before dawn. Newborns too weak to breathe. Stillness in cribs made from broken baskets. Graves dug too small. The miracle of life had become a risk most hoped to avoid, but the bodies kept making their own decisions. No herb could stop nature forever. And in a world where the old rules no longer applied, every birth was a strange defiance. A spark struck in a field of ash. You started to see children not as hope exactly, but as uncertainty. Would they survive? Who would teach them? What world were they entering? And still, they came, wailing into broken villages, swaddled in rags, carried by trembling hands. Their cries were the only truly new sound left. Sharp, hungry, alive, and terrifying in a world that had forgotten what to do with the living. Your memories became strange in the months after the plague, not because they faded, but because they sharpened. You remembered things you hadn't thought of in years, your mother humming as she stirred a pot of stew, the weight of your father's hand on your shoulder, the rough sound of your brother's laugh during chores. They came to you unbidden, often during the smallest moments, kneeling to gather kindling, folding an old cloth, reaching for the last crust of bread. And when they came, they didn't comfort you. They hurt, because they reminded you of what you had lost, not just in people, but in texture, in warmth, in the rhythm of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. You couldn't escape them. You dreamed in fragments, smells, voices, the way the light once fell across the stone floor at dusk. But when you reached for it, tried to hold the scene in your mind, it slipped through your grasp like smoke. Sometimes the faces were clear, sometimes they blurred. You began to fear that time would steal them entirely. You clung to certain objects, not because they were valuable, but because they tethered you to what was. A ladle your mother used, a ragged scarf your sister once wore, a smooth stone your younger cousin used to carry in his pocket, convinced it was lucky. These things became relics, kept not for function, but for memory. You arranged them in little shrines on shelves, window ledges, bedside corners. Not out of superstition, but to remind yourself that they had existed, that you had not imagined your old life. And yet the more you tried to remember, the more the memories turned brittle. You caught yourself second-guessing the sound of your brother's voice. Was it deep or high? Did your father limp, or did he just walk with weight? You used to know, without question. Now everything was coated in doubt. Grief didn't settle like a storm. It circled, pulled back, returned. Some days it was manageable. Others it crushed you. You would hear a distant bell or the rustle of leaves and feel it surge up in your chest like it had just happened, as if everyone had died yesterday. There were mornings you couldn't speak their names without your voice breaking, and nights where you whispered them over and over, just to keep them alive a little longer. Memory became both sanctuary and prison. You lived inside it, but it never gave you peace. It kept you from forgetting, yes, but it also kept you from healing. Because to truly move forward would be to admit they weren't coming back, that the world they belonged to was gone. So you stayed suspended, alive, but tethered to shadows. You learned to work beside your ghosts, to eat with them in silence, to carry them in your tasks like invisible companions. You didn't ask for this. You didn't want to be the keeper of memory, but you were the only one left who remembered, and so you carried it all, until even the act of remembering became its own kind of grief. You stopped taking the old roads. They felt cursed in a way that didn't come from superstition, but from something deeper. abandonment, disuse, a silence too dense to disturb. Villages you once passed through for trade, or visits now stood as hollow husks, their gates half hanging, their wells overgrown, their signs fading under rot and moss. People whispered that these places were haunted, and in a sense, they were. Not by ghosts that wailed or walked, but by the memory of movement. You'd look through a crumbling doorway and see chairs still drawn up to a long empty table, a bowl left on a hearth as if someone had merely stepped outside. But no one ever returned. You wandered into one such place once, chasing a goat that had slipped its tether. The silence hit you like a wall. You stepped carefully, boots crunching over broken pottery and brittle thatch, and you realized this village had died mid-sentence. There were no signs of struggle, just stillness. You backed away without taking anything, not even the pot of grain you spotted near the door. It felt wrong to touch what belonged to the dead. People spoke of these places in hushed tones, like they might wake something by naming them aloud. They called them hollow towns or whispering places. Some claimed they saw figures at dusk moving among the ruins, too far off to identify. Others told stories of voices heard behind walls, of wells that bubbled without wind, of doors that swung shut behind them when no one else was near. You didn't know if any of that was true, but you didn't doubt the unease. You felt it yourself, the weight of places left unburied, homes that had become tombs, not through ritual, but neglect. There were no prayers said in these villages, no candles lit, just silence and slow collapse. And yet, there were times you had no choice but to pass through. The forest paths were too tangled, the main roads too exposed. So you took the edge of the ruined streets, eyes down, breath shallow. You never lingered, you never called out. You didn't enter the houses even when rain came, even when night fell early. You'd rather sleep in the ditch than under a roof that still remembered laughter. One night, you stumbled across a chapel still mostly intact, ivy covering its steeple like a funeral shroud. The door was ajar, and something in you dared to look inside. The pews were empty, the altar bare. But there were shoes, dozens of them, lined up in rows along the wall. Small ones, children's, none matched. You stepped back and didn't look again. You learned quickly, these places weren't meant to be revived. They were cautions, echoes, reminders of how easily a village could vanish, not in fire or war, but in absence. And in a world trying to survive one day at a time, some doors were best left closed, even if they were already open, even if they seemed to call your name. Sometimes the plague came back, not with the same fury, not with the same wave of death sweeping across every home, but in flickers, in whispers, in small, sudden bursts that stole away the sense of peace you'd barely begun to rebuild. You heard the stories first, like rumors carried on the wind, a village 2 days west where 5 people had taken sick, a town near the river where the priest had stopped holding mass because the dead were piling up again. And then it got closer. Someone in your own village, quiet, pale, trembling, taken by a fever. You tried to believe it was just a chill, just bad meat or rotten water. But the signs were too familiar. The coughing, the sores, the silence behind their windows. You didn't need a doctor to tell you what it was. You could feel it in your chest like a weight returning. You had spent months learning how to survive after the worst had passed, but now it all unraveled with terrifying speed. The fear came back stronger than the sickness itself. You'd thought you were safe. You weren't. People panicked, but differently this time. No cries for help, no gatherings in the chapel, just locked doors, curt glances, food left on doorsteps with no words exchanged. Those who could fled, vanishing into the woods, taking their livestock and children with them, hoping to outrun something that didn't always show its face. You didn't leave. You didn't know where you'd go. And besides, what if you took it with you? That was the new fear, more insidious than any boil or shiver, that you might be a carrier, that your hands, your breath, your touch could destroy someone else's fragile grasp on life. You washed obsessively, even when the water ran low. You burned the clothes you thought might be tainted. You slept with a cloth over your mouth and prayed to a God you weren't sure was listening. When the illness did take someone, there were no burials. No one dared. The bodies were left behind doors, in beds, sometimes right where they had fallen. You avoided those homes. You told yourself they were empty. You pretended you hadn't once known the voices that lived inside. Even now, you can picture their faces. You hear their names in your sleep. And you don't say them aloud because names have power and you're afraid of what might still listen. Eventually, it passed again. Not because of anything anyone did, but because that's how it worked. Arbitrary, cruel, and inexplicable. The fever left like it had arrived, without warning. But the village had changed again. Smaller, quieter. You counted fewer footsteps in the mud, fewer windows lit by candlelight. And with the plague's return, something inside you shut for good. The part that had hoped. The part that once dared to believe the worst was behind you. Now you know better. Now you know it never really leaves. It only hides, waiting, like everything else, for the chance to take again. Trust was the first casualty that never came back. Long after the sickness stopped taking lives, it still poisoned the spaces between people. Every cough in the market made heads turn. Every sneeze drew stares. You began to keep your distance from others, not out of malice, but habit. A new kind of etiquette took hold, one built not on kindness, but on fear. You no longer shared bread from the same loaf. You no longer passed cups between hands. Touch became a thing of the past. Even the way you greeted each other changed. Where once there were kisses on cheeks, firm handshakes, or warm embraces, now there was only a nod, maybe a whispered word from behind a scarf. The closeness that once held your village together had unraveled, and you, like everyone else, learned to keep your face turned slightly away, your arms folded tightly across your chest. Not because you hated anyone, but because trust had become too dangerous. You saw it most in the children. They grew up with eyes full of suspicion, watching their parents flinch whenever a neighbor came too near. You remember a boy who wouldn't play with others anymore. He stood apart, stick in hand, tracing circles in the dirt while the others tried to coax him over. When asked why, he simply said, "I don't want to catch the sickness." He hadn't even been born when the worst of it hit, but the fear had passed down like an heirloom. You didn't blame him. The habits of terror weren't easily shed. You had them too, checking doors twice at night, boiling everything that touched another's skin, stepping off paths when strangers approached. It wasn't hatred. It was protection. You didn't want to lose more. You couldn't. Even within families, the cracks had grown. Secrets became common. Someone hid a cough. Someone else concealed a fever. You knew one man who died not because the illness was swift, but because his wife had been too afraid to care for him. She left him water outside the door and slept in the barn until it was over. She mourned him deeply, but she survived. And survival in this new world often looked like cowardice from the outside. But you understood. Everyone did, because you'd all done something like it, even if you never spoke of it aloud. You'd all chosen caution over connection. And that choice, repeated again and again, left your village quieter, colder, and more fragmented than ever before. The plague had ended, but it had taught you something you could not forget. Anyone could be dangerous. even the ones you loved, even yourself. That kind of knowledge settles into the bones. It changes how you move, how you speak, how you sleep. Trust had once been your village's foundation. Now, it was a luxury you could no longer afford. And as you walked the narrow lanes and saw your neighbors doing the same, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, you realized the sickness was gone, but the distance it left behind might never heal. You used to mark the year by sounds, the singing at planting season, the bells at weddings, the cheerful noise of markets on feast days. But now, the calendar felt like a hollow drum. Holidays came and went like ghosts, uncelebrated and unrecognized. The joy had drained from them. What was the point of a harvest festival when there was no one left to dance? Who would bake the bread for saints' days when the oven hadn't been lit in weeks? You remembered a spring, fair, years ago, with ribbons strung from trees and music that spilled into the fields. You had laughed that day, barefoot in the grass, face warm from cider and sunlight. But when the same date came around again, the tree still stood, bare, undecorated, as if mourning. That day passed like all the others now, without ceremony. A quiet meal, a long sleep. You might not have even noticed it at all, if not for the ache it left behind. The church tried. It always tried. The priest, one of the few who'd survived, rang the bell as often as he could manage. He spoke the words of Scripture with more weariness than conviction, and his sermons, once filled with fire, now sounded like whispers carried on wind. The pews were mostly empty, the candles burned low, and the songs, if sung at all, were murmured more from habit than hope. He blessed fields and newborns and homes with trembling hands, even when the people he blessed no longer truly believed anything would come of it. Still, he stood each holy day in the pulpit, cloaked in fading vestments, his voice echoing in the rafters of a chapel far too large for the number of mourners seated below. You wanted to feel something on those days: gratitude, reverence, even joy. But all you felt was absence. The hollowness that came from remembering what these days used to be: feasts with tables full of bread, long evenings lit by lanterns, music that wove through the crowd like thread through cloth. Now every celebration was subdued, every feast was modest, every smile felt borrowed. People tried to pretend, raising mugs, toasting the saints. But it was all thinner somehow, brittle, like trying to build a fire with wet wood. And yet, in the smallest ways, something stubborn remained. A child tying a piece of red cloth to a branch, a loaf of sweet bread left at a neighbor's doorstep, a song hummed too softly to be heard, except by those close enough to listen. These weren't celebrations, not really, but they were gestures, offerings, proof that even in the wake of loss, people still reached for light, however dim. You took comfort in that, not joy, not faith, but the faintest glow of endurance. The idea that even if the old ways had faded, something of them still lingered, in memory, in motion, in the rituals kept alive by quiet hands. A reminder that grief doesn't erase tradition, it reshapes it into something smaller, quieter, but still sacred in its persistence. Trade had once been the lifeblood of your village. The carts rolled in with sacks of barley and bolts of cloth, barrels of salted fish, pots of foreign honey. You remembered the jangle of coins and the chatter in the square, how people would lean in close to haggle, smell spices they couldn't pronounce, run fingers over silks they'd never afford. But after the plague, the roads grew still. The merchants stopped coming. Their wagons, once a fixture, now appeared only in stories. Someone had seen one 3 valleys over. Someone else heard that a trader passed through a nearby town 2 weeks back. But no one ever saw them arrive. No one saw them leave. The silence of the road was almost worse than the plague itself. It meant you were cut off, isolated, left to survive on what the land could provide and what your hands could salvage. And in the absence of trade, life grew narrower. Meals became repetitive. Clothes were patched until they were more repair than fabric. And even time itself felt slower, the months indistinguishable without the rhythm of market days. You tried to make do. Everyone did. But the gaps grew obvious. Salt, once taken for granted, became a luxury. Iron tools dulled and rusted with no one to replace or sharpen them. Needles snapped and couldn't be mended. Even small things, buttons, thread, oil for lamps, vanished one by one. Barter replaced coin, and with fewer people, even that was limited. You once traded a hen's egg for a candle stub. Another time, you gave up your last jar of honey for a single fish hook. Nothing had a fixed value anymore. Worth was measured in desperation. And as scarcity deepened, so did suspicion. Accusations of hoarding, of theft, of unfair deals began to spread. People clutched their baskets tighter, locked their root cellars, and stopped offering their surplus at the communal table. The village that once thrived on shared abundance was now fractured by silent need. And then there was the danger on the roads themselves. With no consistent travelers, no guards, no lords patrolling their fiefdoms, the woods grew bolder. Bandits, wolves, even former villagers turned desperate, roaming the countryside and stealing what they could find. You didn't dare walk more than a mile without a tool or a weapon. You traveled in groups when you could. You left nothing behind when you moved. No food, no sign of your route. The forest paths that had once been shaded escapes in summer now felt like open threats. You couldn't even trust the quiet anymore. It was too complete, too absolute. Still, you hoped. Every time you heard the distant creak of a cartwheel, every time dust rose on the horizon, you felt that old flicker. Maybe this time it was a merchant. Maybe they brought salt, or bread, or news. But it was never what you hoped. Just wind, or some forager like you, eyes down, hands empty. The roads hadn't just grown still, they had forgotten you. And the world beyond your borders kept turning, indifferent to whether you ever saw it again. The nights had changed. They used to feel like a pause, a soft closing of the day, a time to rest your limbs and listen to the familiar sounds of hearth and home. But now, nightfall brought only unease. With fewer candles and no oil to spare, darkness returned with full authority, thick and total. The shadows pressed against the windows like hands. Every creak of wood, every rustle outside, stirred old fears. You'd lie awake listening, wondering if it was the wind, an animal, or someone desperate enough to steal. You remembered a time when you'd walk outside at night without worry, stepping out to fetch water or let the cool air settle your thoughts. But now you barred the doors, drew cloth over windows, and kept your tools within reach. Not out of paranoia, but experience. Because grief changes a village. It makes people strange. And in that strangeness, even the ones you once trusted became unknowable after dark. You began to sleep in shifts, one eye always open, always waiting. Dreams, when they came, were not gentle. They were filled with firelight and coughing, doors swinging open to empty rooms, graves dug by moonlight. You'd wake with your heart pounding, a cold sweat on your back, the embers in the hearth barely glowing. And there was no one to whisper to in the dark, no sibling in the next bed, no old dog to press close for warmth. The house felt too large and too hollow. Even the silence had texture to it, dense, unkind. You sometimes whispered aloud, just to break it, just to hear something human, but even your own voice felt foreign. In the distance, you might hear the howling of wolves or the bark of a stray dog. But worse were the nights with no sound at all. just stillness, as if the world outside had stopped moving. That stillness made you feel like you'd been forgotten, like nothing lived beyond your door. You tried to keep a rhythm, waking early, sleeping when the stars rose, but the nights stretched longer, as if time itself had slowed. You marked them in candles, in how many times you stirred the coals, in how many breaths you took, waiting for sleep that never came. When morning finally returned, it wasn't always a comfort. The daylight revealed what the dark had hidden: empty fields, shuttered windows, the quiet shuffle of others going about their lonely routines. But at least the dark had lifted. You'd survived another night, and that counted for something. Still, the fear lingered. You carried it into the day like a weight in your chest, because you knew the darkness would come again. And each time it did, you wondered if it would bring with it something worse than silence. You no longer feared death the way you once did, but you feared the long, quiet nights that led up to it. You feared being alone with your memories, alone with the dark, alone with nothing but the sound of your own breath, trying to remember what life felt like before the world grew so still. You began to measure life in what was missing, not in days or seasons, not in the waxing of moons or the weight of a harvest, but in absences. The smell of your mother's stew never returned to your hearth. The sound of children playing, once so constant it was background noise, had vanished completely. Even the birds seemed fewer. You walked through your village with a growing awareness of gaps: the silent cottage with its broken door swinging in the breeze, the field that hadn't been tilled in 2 summers, the absence of smoke from chimneys that used to signal life and warmth. The world around you had not just changed, it had thinned. You could feel the hollowness in everything, as if creation itself had been carved out by grief. And as the seasons turned, you realized the world wasn't repairing itself. It was adapting to the loss. And so were you. Your conversations were shorter now. People didn't linger after words were spoken. No one wanted to talk about the past, and there was little to say about the future. So you stuck to weather, to livestock, to work, topics that required no emotion, no memory. Even laughter had changed. When it came, it startled people. It felt out of place, brittle and foreign. And when you heard yourself laugh, it never reached your eyes. That brightness had dulled. You still worked, because you had to. But it felt like you were acting out an old script written for a village that no longer existed. You planted seeds, but no children ran beside you. You hauled water, but no one met you at the well. And when you sat by the fire at night, you didn't tell stories. You just stared at the flames, wondering if they remembered more than you did. There was a heaviness in the air that never lifted. Not a storm, not a sickness, but something quieter. The weight of memory, maybe, or the quiet resignation that this was your world now. You no longer asked why. That question had become dangerous. It led to tears, to prayer, to the kind of hollow ache that couldn't be filled. Instead, you accepted. This was survival. This was life. And it was hard. You woke each day knowing you would walk through ruins, some of them physical, others invisible, stitched into the faces of the people around you. You did not expect joy. You did not chase hope, but you moved. You endured, because what else was there? And yet beneath all this, there was a stubbornness in you, a tiny flame. Not hope exactly, but defiance. You hadn't died, you were still here. And maybe that meant something. Maybe surviving meant more than just breathing. Maybe it meant remembering, even when the memories hurt. Maybe it meant holding on to what had been so the world didn't forget. You didn't know, but you kept walking. Through the quiet, through the missing pieces, through a village that had once been whole and might be again. The silence of the graveyard had grown louder over time. At first, when the plague had taken its worst toll, the cemetery had been overwhelmed. Graves dug hastily, Bodies laid side by side, names never etched in stone. There were no priests then, no rites, no candles flickering by the crosses. Just soil, heavy with sorrow, and the smell of earth turned too often. But now, years later, when the fever had long since faded and the world tried to move on, the graveyard remained the most truthful place you could visit. It hadn't changed. The moss grew thicker, the wooden markers faded or collapsed, and the names, when visible, felt like echoes. And yet, you went there, not daily, but often enough, because among the overgrowth and the silence, at least the grief was honest. You could sit beside a mound and let your sadness breathe without explanation. No one judged tears there. No one needed you to be strong. The living had forgotten how to mourn out loud, but the dead still listened. Sometimes you'd bring something with you, a dried flower, a carving, a piece of cloth from an old tunic. It didn't matter who you left it for. They were all part of you now, all pieces of the same wound. You didn't always remember their faces clearly. Memory blurred them over time, especially those who had faded before you had time to say goodbye. But you remembered their warmth, their voice, the way they made you feel before the world went quiet. That was the cruelest part of surviving, the knowing. The endless knowing that you had lived through what others didn't, and no amount of gratitude or sorrow could balance the scale. People in the village avoided the graveyard unless they had to. They said it was unlucky that the plague still clung to the soil like fog. But you knew better. The real reason they stayed away was fear. Fear of feeling too much. The cemetery forced you to remember, and remembering hurt. It reminded you that even now, even with fields planted again and roofs repaired, nothing was truly healed. The world had been stitched back together, but the seams still split when tugged. And that graveyard? It was a tapestry of those seams, laid bare and open to the sky. You didn't find comfort there. Not exactly. But you found truth. In a world where people tried to smile a little too brightly, speak a little too quickly, as if to drown out the past, the graveyard spoke plainly. Loss had shaped you. It had carved out part of your soul, and no harvest or holy day would ever fully fill it in. But in that hollow space, you had room to grieve, room to remember. And sometimes, when the wind was still and the clouds hung low, you'd swear the village itself breathed through that graveyard, quiet, mournful, and enduring. A place where sorrow had weight, and in its weight, a strange kind of peace. Children born after the plague saw a different world than the one you remembered. They had no memory of crowded festivals, of singing in the square, or of the warmth of a full household around the hearth. Their lullabies were quieter, their games lonelier, and their questions sharper. They asked why the chapel had so many empty pews, why half the houses had no smoke in their chimneys, why so many adults stared out windows in silence. You tried to explain gently, but what words could capture the scale of what had been lost? What story could prepare them for a world built on ghosts? These children had never known the sound of a village at full voice. They'd grown up among ruins, among caution and hushed conversations. They learned early how to stretch food, how to carry water without spilling a drop, how to read a cough in someone's face like a warning bell. Their innocence had been stripped by inheritance, not from neglect, but from necessity. You watched them carry burdens they didn't understand. A girl no older than 6 feeding chickens before dawn, a boy digging a root cellar beside his grandfather, neither of them speaking. Children did not play like you once had. There were no elaborate pretend battles, no noisy games of chase across the green. Their play was quiet and practical, gathering sticks, making traps for birds, mimicking the adults with miniature tools. There was no time to be a child, not really. The plague had stolen their elders, and in doing so, had stolen their youth. You saw it in their eyes, too watchful, too tired, as if they'd been born halfway into a world already mourning itself. And yet, they were the future. In the silence left behind, they would be the ones to rebuild, not with memories of what once was, but with instinct and adaptation that both inspired and terrified you. Because how could they rebuild what they never saw? Would they invent something new, or would they drift further from what had been until even memory became dust? You caught yourself speaking aloud sometimes, telling them stories they hadn't asked for, about the baker who used to leave pastries in his windows, about the woman who played the harp at dusk, about the time the whole village danced after a summer storm. The children listened politely, but they didn't truly understand. These were tales from a land they'd never visited, a country erased by a sickness they couldn't remember. Still, you told the stories, not for their understanding, but for your own. Because if the memory survived, maybe something of the past still lived. And maybe, in time, the children would feel it too, not as a burden, but as a seed, a reason to plant, to sing, to build. You couldn't give them the world you once knew, but perhaps, with patience and time, they would grow something new from its ashes. Something quieter, yes, but enduring all the same. You used to think of the body as a kind of servant, something you could command, something that would always respond to your needs so long as you gave it food, warmth, and rest. But after the plague, your relationship with your body changed. It no longer felt trustworthy. The smallest ache stirred worry. A sore throat brought fear. A chill in the night could unravel your peace. The plague had taught you just how fragile you were, how easily skin could bruise, lungs could fill, breath could falter. And even though the worst was over, your body now moved with a kind of haunted awareness. You paid closer attention to every shiver, every cough, every twitch in the limbs. Each one could be the beginning of something. You lived in a constant state of preemptive mourning, preparing yourself, guarding yourself, unsure if your own flesh would betray you again. This wasn't paranoia, it was memory, embedded deep into your bones. You noticed others doing the same. A woman touching her forehead, unsure if it felt warmer than yesterday. A man holding his side and glancing around to see if anyone had noticed. Conversations often veered toward health, who had slept poorly, whose appetite had changed, who seemed pale. You'd never spoken so much about your body before. But now, every villager had become part physician, part patient. Without real healers left, most of them lost to the same sickness. They'd filled the void with folk remedies, superstitions, and whispered advice. Vinegar cloths, crushed garlic, soot under fingernails. You tried them all, not because you believed they worked, but because doing nothing felt too much like surrender. The fear of illness lingered in your posture. You walked more carefully, worried a twisted ankle could become something worse. You ate cautiously, watching every meal for signs of spoilage. And above all, you stayed away from the sick. Even now, even when it might only be a cold, the presence of illness in someone else brought with it that old weight. The unspoken terror that the plague had not truly left, that it was sleeping, waiting, and your vigilance was the only thing standing between survival and collapse. You didn't pity the sick the way you once had. You feared them. You avoided them. And when it was you who fell ill, you understood why others did the same. What you missed most was trust. Not just in others, but in your own body. You missed the days when you could run without fearing the cost, eat without examining every bite, lie under the stars without wondering if the chill in your chest was the start of something fatal. Now, your health felt like borrowed time. Every moment without pain was a gift, but one you received with suspicion. You no longer lived inside your body with ease. You inhabited it the way you might a house struck by lightning, grateful it still stood, but wary of the next storm. And so you moved through each day with a quiet reverence for the ordinary. because even comfort had become something hard won. You once found comfort in the rhythm of church bells. They rang out across the fields like anchors, calling the faithful, marking time, assuring you that someone, somewhere, still held order in their hands. Before the plague, the bells tolled for births, weddings, deaths, and mass. They were the heartbeat of the village, summoning people to gather, to grieve, to celebrate. But after the worst had passed, the bells rang far less often. Sometimes, not at all. Many churches had lost their priests. Some had lost their congregations. Others were simply too quiet, too broken, their steeples cracked or their doors hanging loose on rusted hinges. In some villages, the bells were taken down, melted for coin, or left to rust in the grass. And in their absence, you realized how much you had relied on them. Not just for faith, but for the sense that life had a rhythm, a center, a sacred echo. When they did ring, the sound no longer meant what it once had. It startled people, made them stop and listen, unsure if it was joy or another funeral. You'd watch villagers pause mid-task, tilt their heads, and try to decipher the tone. Even weddings had become subdued, their bells hesitant, as if joy felt too fragile to ring out fully. The great iron tongues that once sang proudly now whispered. Some said it was because the churches were haunted. Others said it was out of respect for the dead. But you knew it was grief, lingering, shapeless grief that hung over every sacred threshold. Inside the churches, little had survived. The pews were dusty, the floor cold. Candles, once abundant, were now rare luxuries. The smell of incense had faded, replaced by damp stone and memory. Where choirs once sang, silence lingered. Where priests once preached, there were hesitant replacements. Farmers turned deacons, widows reading scripture from memory. You respected them, not for their knowledge, but for their courage. Because standing in front of the living and trying to make sense of death was a task you wouldn't wish on anyone. The holy words rang thinner now. They echoed in half-empty rooms. And often you left church with more questions than when you entered. And yet, you still went. Not every week, but often enough. Because faith, like breath, was something you didn't always understand, but knew you needed. Even if it didn't answer you, it kept you tethered. Some days it was a memory, other days a small flicker, but in a world that had unraveled, even the faintest light was something. So you bowed your head, you crossed yourself. You listened to stories you'd heard 100 times before and let them settle into your bones like warmth. Because in those stone walls, cracked as they were, there was still a sense of shelter. And as long as the bells could ring, even if just once more, you believed the village might still remember what it meant to hope. Winter was always difficult, but after the plague, it became something else entirely. A test not just of endurance, but of the will to continue. The cold came earlier, it seemed, and stayed longer. Not because the climate had changed, but because fewer hands meant fewer preparations. Firewood was scarcer, roofs were less mended, livestock had dwindled, and the preserved meats from the previous year were long since gone. There had been no proper harvest season last autumn, no village gathering to gather in the grain, just small, desperate attempts to bring in what little was left before frost took it. Now the days were short, the wind cruel, and the nights impossibly long. You huddled beneath every scrap of wool you owned, listening to the rafters creak and hoping the thatch wouldn't give way. You rationed food so tightly that hunger no longer came in waves. It was just always there, a constant pressure behind your ribs. Inside the home, the hearth burned low to make the firewood last. You kept to one room, closing the others off to conserve warmth. The walls felt closer in winter, the air thicker with breath and sorrow. You stopped talking as much. Words felt wasteful. You learned the language of silence, how to read a glance, how to listen for the sighs in the night. If you were lucky, you had someone with you, a sibling, a cousin, maybe an elder who had somehow survived. But many didn't. Many lived that winter alone, and the loneliness and the cold was worse than frostbite. You could wrap your fingers, boil herbs, and patch your shoes, but you couldn't stitch up the silence. You couldn't warm yourself with absence. Outside, the land offered nothing. Snow blanketed the fields where crops once grew, the well froze in the mornings, and the paths to the next village were too treacherous to travel. Even if you dared to go, what would you find? Another ghost town? Another abandoned house with pots still hanging on the wall, chairs still tucked beneath the table, as if the owners might return from the dead to finish their meal. The plague had hollowed the world, and winter filled it with frost. You wondered at times if spring would come at all. You stopped dreaming of green shoots and thawed earth. You dreamed of bread, of warmth, of laughter echoing in the snow. Dreams so distant they felt like memories you had borrowed from someone else. And yet somehow, you made it through. You woke each day with frost on your eyelashes, fed the fire, scraped together a meal, and waited for the sun to rise again. Because even in the coldest hours, something in you refused to go still. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just that strange, stubborn instinct not to let the silence win. Winter was no longer just a season, it was a trial. And if you endured it, you hadn't beaten it. Not really, but you had endured. And in the world left behind by plague, that was everything. There was a kind of guilt that never left you, even years after the worst had passed. Not the loud kind, not something you confessed in a chapel or wept about beside the fire. It was quieter than that, more patient. It lived in your bones, settled into your breath. You'd wake with it before dawn, sit beside it as you chewed your morning crust, and carry it with you into the fields. It followed you like a shadow, this strange, heavy knowledge that you were alive while others were not. You hadn't done anything special. You hadn't fought harder or prayed better or hidden more cleverly. You had simply endured. And that somehow made it harder. Because if there was no reason you had survived, then there was no reason they had died. The plague had been indifferent. It had taken the kind and the cruel, the strong and the weak, the faithful and the questioning. And so your survival felt less like a blessing and more like a burden, something you hadn't earned but had to carry anyway. You tried to tell yourself that guilt was useless, that it helped no one, changed nothing. But logic did little to ease the ache. You'd pass a home with shutters still closed, the chimney forever cold, and remember the laughter that once spilled from it. You'd see a child playing alone and think of the sister who never got to grow up. Every corner of the village was marked with absences, and those empty places whispered a single question: why not you? Some days, you could almost ignore it. You'd keep busy, keep moving, let the sun and wind distract you. But then something small, a smell, a sound, a patch of fabric, would break you open again. The guilt never screamed. It whispered. And its whispers were worse. Others felt it too. You saw it in their eyes when they spoke of the dead, in the way their voices dipped or their hands trembled slightly when mentioning names. Nobody talked about it directly. You were all too tired, too careful, but the silence was its own confession. Some tried to atone by working harder, by giving more, by adopting orphaned children, or rebuilding homes. But no matter what you did, the dead didn't return, and the guilt didn't leave. It simply found new places to rest. You learned to live with it. You had no choice. Over time, it became like an old injury, sore in the mornings, bearable by midday, aching again by night. Some days it drove you to kindness. Other days it made you cold, but always it reminded you of the price that had been paid for your continued breath. Surviving the plague wasn't a victory march. It was a quiet, lifelong trudge through a landscape reshaped by death. And that guilt, unwanted and uninvited, was part of your shadow now, proof that the heart, even when broken, keeps beating. The stories changed after the plague, not the old ones, the saints and the miracles, the creation tales whispered around fires. Those still lingered, cracked and dusty but repeated out of habit. No, what changed were the new stories, the ones people didn't mean to tell. You'd hear them in fragments. A woman muttering about a cart that rattled past her house at midnight, piled high with the dead. A man recalling how he burned his neighbor's clothes, unable to look him in the eye as he did it. Children talking in hushed voices about spirits that lived in abandoned barns or shadows that moved when no one was there. These weren't just stories for entertainment. They were attempts to make sense of the senseless, to speak the unspeakable through fiction. Because the truth, that death had come, swift and cruel, and left no meaning in its wake, was too much to carry in plain language. So people turned to myths. They gave the plague a face, a will, a hunger. It wasn't just disease, it became something else. Something that could be feared without being understood. You noticed how often people invoked fate now. Before, misfortune had reasons. A poor harvest came from bad weather. Illness came from bad air or bad food. But after the plague, reasons felt hollow. So people said it was fate, God's will, a divine reckoning. They whispered of punishments and omens, of curses and broken covenants. It was easier than accepting the randomness of it all, and the stories helped carry the weight. They became shields, explanations, even comforts. Better to believe the plague had a purpose than to admit it was blind. Better to think your loved one had been chosen by some unknowable plan than that they had simply died for nothing. You found yourself doing it too, telling stories that weren't quite true, not because you meant to lie, but because truth felt incomplete. You said your brother had seen a vision before he died, that he smiled at something in the distance. You told children that the spirits of the dead had joined the wind, watching over the village from the trees. These tales didn't bring back the dead, but they gave the living a shape for their grief, something to hold on to when memory grew sharp. You weren't proud of it, but you weren't ashamed either. Storytelling had always been part of how people survived. And in a world where logic had failed you, stories were all that remained. Sometimes, late at night, you wondered what stories would be told of you. Would they remember your name? Would they say you were brave or just lucky? Would they know the truth, that survival wasn't strength, but persistence? That you kept walking because there was no other choice? You didn't know, but you hoped in some future gathering someone would tell a story, not about the plague, but about those who lived after, who carried the sorrow and still found the strength to speak. The days blurred together in the years that followed the plague. Time, once marked by festivals and feasts, by baptisms and weddings and saints' days, no longer had its same rhythm. There were fewer celebrations, fewer voices to ring in the new season, fewer hands to hang garlands or toll the bells. The calendar still existed, yes. There were still solstices, still harvests, still the turning of the year. But it all felt fainter, quieter, as though the seasons themselves were unsure how to continue without their people. You found yourself forgetting what month it was. You measured days by the firewood stack, or the growing of the barley, or the ache in your joints. Morning followed night, followed morning, and sometimes it was hard to remember what had happened yesterday, let alone a year ago. Grief blurred memory like fog. Time became less something you lived in, and more something you endured. You tried to hold on to rituals, lighting candles, saying prayers, singing an old song while you baked or worked the fields. They helped. They reminded you that there was a before. But even those practices began to feel brittle. Songs that once lifted your spirit now made your throat tighten. The words came back wrong, or too slowly, like a language you no longer quite spoke. You missed the feeling of time moving with purpose. Now it just stretched, days long and slow, nights longer still. Some in the village began counting their age not by years, but by how many seasons had passed since the sickness, as if time itself had reset when the plague hit, and everything after was a kind of shadow era, not quite real. Children asked questions you struggled to answer. What was it like before, they'd say, wide-eyed, not out of curiosity, but as if trying to imagine another planet. You told them of spring fairs with music, of processions and colored banners, of laughter that didn't sound forced, but it felt distant even as you spoke. And you worried sometimes that you'd romanticized it, that the world before had its own miseries, its own injustices, and you only remembered the brightness because of the darkness that followed. You didn't know how much was nostalgia, how much was truth, but you kept telling the stories because the children needed them. If they didn't inherit your memories, then what was the point of surviving? You learned, painfully, that time alone doesn't heal. It dulls, it layers, it changes the shape of pain, but it doesn't erase. And without milestones to mark its passing, time became heavy, slow, and uncertain. Still, the sun rose, the snow melted, the grain grew, life went on, not in triumph, but in quiet repetition. And so did you. There was no feast to welcome you into healing, no festival to celebrate survival, just the slow rhythm of living, day by day, with a past that would not leave you and a future you dared not yet imagine. Every so often, you found yourself walking past places you used to avoid, old houses, overgrown graveyards, ruins where children once played. In the early years after the plague, you'd hurried past those places with your head down, afraid of what memories they might drag up. But now, years on, something pulled you back to them. Not out of curiosity, exactly, but out of a quiet need to understand what remained. The village graveyard had changed the most. Stones tilted like tired shoulders. Some names had faded entirely. Others had no names at all, just a wooden marker, or nothing. You remembered when the bodies came faster than the priests could bury them, when the ground had to be dug day and night. It still felt strange to see grass growing over those hurried mounds. Nature never asked permission to move on. It just did. Flowers returned, birds nested in broken walls, ivy crept up the stones. It felt like betrayal and comfort all at once. You stood there sometimes in silence, counting how many people you had loved who now lay beneath that earth. You tried to speak their names out loud, just to keep them real, but your voice would catch, and you'd stop after the first or second name, too overwhelmed by how many were missing. Some of them you hadn't even said goodbye to. Some had vanished before you knew they were sick. And some you'd buried with your own hands. That memory never softened. The smell of lime, the weight of the shovel, the way your back ached more from sorrow than from labor. You never forgot that. Other places in the village held ghosts too. A broken fence that once marked a garden, now sprouting weeds instead of carrots. A pair of shoes left behind on a doorstep, long outgrown and rain-warped. A shuttered window that hadn't opened since the sickness took its last breath inside. You found yourself staring at these things longer than you should have, wondering why you still returned to them. Perhaps it was a kind of penance, or perhaps it was a form of love. Because even ruins deserve to be remembered. Even emptiness carries meaning if someone bears witness to it. Not everyone understood this. Most people avoided those places, or rebuilt over them. They wanted to forget. You didn't blame them. Forgetting was easier than remembering, and it was hard enough just to survive. But you couldn't forget. The past wasn't gone. It lived beneath your feet, in your chest, in every quiet morning that didn't begin with a scream. You carried it not as a burden, but as a truth, one that shaped the way you lived now, with more tenderness, more caution, and a reverence for things most people no longer noticed. A faded name on a headstone, the whisper of wind through an open door, the feeling that, even now, not everything had been lost. Some things, like memory, like sorrow, like love, still lingered. And in that lingering, there was life. There were fewer children playing in the fields now, and the ones that did had a different kind of energy, quieter, more cautious, as if even laughter had learned to tread carefully. Before the plague, the village had been full of noise. You remembered it vividly. Shouts, giggles, the wild barking of dogs chasing after sticks, the rustle of skirts and cloaks as mothers called their children back from the forest's edge. But now, the silences between those sounds had grown longer, heavier. The children who remained had either been too young to remember what came before or old enough to carry a lifetime of loss inside them. You saw it in their eyes. Even their games had changed. No more mock battles or playful mischief. Instead, they built makeshift shrines out of stones, held solemn pretend funerals, or wandered in small, watchful groups, speaking in hushed tones as if the village itself might wake and remember what it had lost. You tried to shield them, to offer small joys when you could, a boiled sweet, a story told by firelight, a carved toy from a bit of scrap wood. But there was only so much you could protect them from. The world they had inherited was not the one you grew up in. It was smaller, dimmer, and bound by the memory of absence. Many of these children had lost both parents. Some had no siblings left. They had grown up fast, forced into roles far beyond their years. You saw a boy of 10 mending his own shoes, a girl barely 12 tending goats and comforting her younger cousins. Childhood had become a job. Innocence was a luxury no one could afford. Still, they endured. That's what amazed you the most. Even with all they'd seen, they kept going. They still climbed trees, even if more carefully. They still whispered secrets in corners, even if their laughter faded quickly afterward. Some of them began helping in the fields or apprenticing with the few artisans who remained. They were rebuilding something, though they might not have realized it yet. Each game played, each song hummed under a breath. It was all part of the slow reweaving of life. You found hope in that, though it made your heart ache, because you knew how much they'd never get back, how much had been taken from them before they even had the chance to understand it. And so you watched over them, not just as a protector, but as a witness. You wanted them to know that someone saw them, remembered the weight they carried, even if they never spoke of it. In their faces, you saw the future of the village. Scarred, yes, but not broken. These children bore a different kind of wisdom, not the kind taught in books or churches, but the kind learned by surviving. And if there was ever to be joy again, you knew it would begin with them. Not with celebration, but with quiet resilience, passed hand to hand like a candle in the dark. Trade never really returned the way it had been. Before the plague, merchants had come regularly, clattering wagons full of cloth, salt, spices, iron tools, and news from distant cities. You'd gather near the market square, fingers dusty with coins, bartering over bolts of linen or a pouch of peppercorns. There had been color then, bright fabrics catching the sun, smells of cured meat and beeswax, voices overlapping in the rhythm of bargaining. But afterward, all that changed. Roads grew emptier. Many merchants had died, and those who survived were slow to return, afraid of the disease still hiding in unfamiliar hands. The ones who did come charged more, much more. Goods that had once been common, salt, needles, even good boots, became precious rarities. You learned to do without. to mend what was torn, to boil your own dye, grind your own flour, barter bread for buttons. Life grew smaller, tighter, stitched together from scraps of what had been. The isolation was as much emotional as it was physical. Without trade, without travelers, the world shrank. News arrived late or not at all. Stories of distant kings, of changing laws or spreading wars, lost their urgency. Everything beyond your village felt like a faded dream, half remembered, distant, untrustworthy. You stopped caring about what happened in the next shire, let alone across the sea. Your concerns narrowed to the next harvest, the weather, whether the smith's forge had enough charcoal, whether the healer had any herbs left for fevers. The broader world no longer mattered. It had abandoned you, and you had, in a quiet way, abandoned it in return. When traders finally came through again, they looked different, worn thin by the road, distrustful. They barely spoke unless spoken to, and they avoided staying long. You couldn't blame them. Every village they passed could be another outbreak waiting to happen. You saw the way they kept their gloves on, their cloaks pulled high, their distance maintained. The cheerful exchange of coin and news had become a cautious transaction. You no longer greeted strangers with open arms, but with suspicion. What are you bringing? Where have you been? Have you lost anyone recently? The questions weren't spoken, but they lingered like smoke in the air. Still, you longed for what the merchants represented: connection, renewal, the idea that life beyond the village might still exist. When someone returned with a tin cup, a new pair of shears, or a strange tale of a city slowly rebuilding, it felt like the faintest tug of thread from some frayed web that still stretched across the land. Proof that the world wasn't completely broken, that somewhere people still made things, still told stories, still risked the road. Even if trade never returned in full, even if the markets remained half empty and quiet, you cherished those rare moments of contact, because they reminded you that the plague hadn't killed everything. There were still roads, still wagons, still voices crossing the distance. And where there were voices, there was life. The land itself had begun to change, as though it too had been infected by the silence left behind. Where once there had been order, rows of tilled soil, stone fences, neat pastures, there was now wildness. Weeds grew tall and unbothered in places, once carefully managed. Thorny bramble crept across forgotten paths, and trees stretched further into open fields, their roots cracking what remained of old stone walls. The animals changed too. Livestock still wandered, but there were fewer of them. Deer had returned in greater numbers, bold and unafraid. Birds nested in chimneys. Wolves were seen closer to the village now, their howls no longer something distant and mythical, but real and unsettling. Nature had filled the spaces humanity had left behind, and sometimes you felt like a guest in your own homeland, outnumbered, outpaced, no longer in control. There was something both beautiful and terrifying about it. The world didn't stop when people died. It simply moved on, without waiting for you to catch up. Farming became harder in this new wilderness. It wasn't just that there were fewer hands to work the land, it was that the land itself had become unpredictable. Fields left unplowed for a season or two had gone to seed, overtaken by thistles and stubborn grasses that didn't yield easily to the plow. Soil that once gave grain without complaint now resisted you. You fought for every furrow, every patch of clean ground, every root pulled free from the stubborn tangle. What used to be a rhythm, plant, grow, harvest, was now a battle, and there were no guarantees. A missed planting window could mean a long winter of hunger. A single summer storm could flatten what you had labored months to grow. Every harvest felt like a fragile promise, never abundance, just survival. You remembered what it had been like before, how villages worked the land together, in teams and rotations, with shared tools and shared labor. Now, those systems had frayed. Trust had become more precious than iron, and people guarded what little they had. Communal fields were left untended. Neighbors who once traded seeds or helped mend fences were now more likely to stay behind closed doors. You didn't blame them. Fear did that to people. Still, it hurt. The land had always been hard. It didn't need fear to make it harder. And yet, for all its unpredictability, the land remained your only certainty. The church might falter, the markets might empty, but the earth would still turn. Seeds would still sprout if coaxed. Rain would still fall, whether gently or cruelly. You learned to listen again, to birdsong that hinted at changing seasons, to the feel of soil between your fingers, to the wind and its shifting moods. The land had changed, yes, but so had you. You were no longer the farmer who looked at fields and saw prosperity. You looked at them now and saw struggle, resilience, and the long road of recovery. But you tilled the earth anyway, because it was the only way forward. Rebuilding the village was never a matter of stones or timber. It was a matter of hearts, of trust, of finding ways to live together again after so much had been lost. The physical labor was hard, yes. Roofs had caved in, bridges had rotted, whole homes had collapsed under weather and neglect. But that was fixable, at least in theory. What took far longer was convincing people to believe in community again. The plague hadn't just taken lives, it had scattered people, turned neighbors into strangers, made every cough feel like a threat. After years of that, it was hard to return to shared tables, to open doorways, to the idea that the people around you could be part of your safety rather than a risk. You saw it in the way folks hesitated before greeting one another, in the way they lingered near the edges of gatherings, in how no one touched unless they had to. You could build a new home in weeks, but rebuilding trust took seasons, years. Some tried to return to old traditions. They organized feasts, small festivals, even marriages. These events were quiet at first, cautious, like someone humming a tune they barely remembered. A spring blessing in the fields, a shared pot of stew in the town square. A few songs sung without instruments because the musicians had died or left. At first, the gatherings felt like pretend, like people playing at joy. But slowly, hesitantly, they began to feel real. Children danced again. Elders shared stories. Someone brought out a crude fiddle and played until the stars blinked overhead. These moments were fragile. They didn't erase what had happened, but they gave shape to what might come next. Still, not everyone came back. Many who left never returned. Some villages nearby were simply abandoned, wooden beams collapsing inward, weeds reclaiming the paths. You visited once or twice, drawn by memory, only to find silence and rot. It was sobering, a reminder of what your home could have become, of how thin the line was between recovery and disappearance. Your own village had come close. You remembered the months when it felt like giving up might be easier, when even the birds seemed to sing less. But something kept you going. A stubbornness, maybe, or love, or the need to not let the dead be forgotten. Now, when you walked the village paths, you saw evidence of both loss and persistence. Repaired fences, replanted gardens, a new thatch roof beside a ruin that no one dared enter. The contrast never stopped feeling strange. Hope beside grief, light beside shadow. But that was life now. Layered, contradictory, honest. You didn't pretend things were as they once were. They never would be. But you found a new rhythm. One built not on forgetting, but on carrying memory forward. Every act of repair, mending a wall, sharing a loaf, laughing at the fire, was its own kind of resistance, a soft refusal to let sorrow win. And in that, perhaps, was the beginning of something like healing. When you lay in bed at night, staring into the dark rafters above, you often wondered why you were still here. Not in a morbid way, not anymore, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. The question had followed you for years, since the worst had passed. You had seen so many stronger people die, kinder people, braver ones. Entire families had vanished in days, while you remained, stubborn and stunned and impossibly alive. For a long time, you carried that survival like a weight. It made you quieter, more watchful. You didn't laugh the way you used to. You were careful with hope. And yet the days kept coming. You kept waking up. You kept finding reasons, small ones, often, to go on. A loaf of bread that rose just right. A moment of birdsong. The warmth of a hand clasped in yours, even if it was a stranger's. These things didn't fix anything, but they made the silence easier to bear. You learned to live with absence like one learns to live with a limp. You adapted. You built new habits around it. You didn't talk about the people you'd lost every day, but they lived in everything you did. In the way you said good morning to no one in particular, in how you lingered near places that used to be full, in the way you spoke to children, always softer now, as if shielding them from an echo only you could hear. You weren't the same as before, and that was fine. You'd stopped trying to return to who you'd been. That person had died too, in a way. You were someone new now, someone made of scar tissue and long walks and unspoken prayers. Some days you felt the old grief stir again, sharp, sudden, inexplicable, a scent, a tune, a quiet moment between chores. But you didn't push it away. You let it sit with you like an old friend, not because you missed the pain, but because it reminded you of love. You had survived because you had loved deeply. That was the truth of it. And the ache of that loss was a reminder that your life had been full, even if it had been broken. You tried to share that when you could. You told stories. You listened. You offered silence when words weren't enough. You became, in your own way, a keeper of memory, not because anyone asked you to, but because someone had to. Now, as you drift into sleep, you know that the worst has passed, not vanished, not erased, but endured. And in that endurance, something else has grown, a quieter kind of strength, not flashy or celebrated, but steady, gentle, like the slow blooming of a flower after a long winter. You don't need monuments to your suffering. The world carries your story in its fields, in its changed rhythms, in the laughter that's finally beginning to return. And that, you realize, is enough. You survived. And in doing so, you made space for life to begin again.